Du Conseil national,
President of the National Council, President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, ladies and gentlemen, panelists, guests, participants, ladies and gentlemen, friends of democracy, I'd like to call you. It's a great pleasure for me to open this Bern conference on democracy in times of crisis. Today, we're actually celebrating 3 birthdays. Precisely 75 years ago, this is the first birthday, from the 7th to the 10th of May 1948, the Hague Congress met. And a year later, that is what gave birth to the Council of Europe. It arose out of the ashes of Auschwitz. And this new organization had the purpose of building and consolidating peace in Europe on the basis of 2 fundamental principles, freedom and justice. Sadly, today, Europe is again facing the horrors of war following the illegal act of aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine. And we all realize today more than ever that if the Council of Europe did not exist, it would be necessary to invent it. But happily, it does exist, and we therefore need to take care of it. For that reason, it is good that heads of state and government are meeting in just a few days' time in Reykjavik, and they will be meeting for a summit of heads of state and government of the Council of Europe to organize the future of our organization. 3/4 of a century ago, then, Switzerland had something to do with the establishment of the Council of Europe. It was in Zurich in 1946 that Winston Churchill laid the foundation stones of Europe as we know it today in a very famous speech. And it was a Swiss national. Indeed, I'm proud to say it was someone from my own canton of Neuchâtel, the philosopher and essayist Denis de Rougemont, who drafted and who then read to the Hague Congress 75 years ago his message to Europeans. And that was what concluded the Congress and then laid the basis for the European Court of Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, and the Parliamentary Assembly. So I think that was quite an achievement, you would agree. The Council of Europe, when it was established then, reflected what Denis de Rougemont said. He looked around and he said that the world had never seen such a great gathering of men, we would say today also women, who were free. Never, did he say, had there been such a strong adversary to the forces of war, fear and poverty. Despite that, Switzerland took a few years to join the Council of Europe, and it was only in 1963, May 1963, that it did so. So that's the second birthday to celebrate today. When Switzerland joined the Council of Europe, the President, Pierre Pemlang, the President of the Parliamentary Assembly, emphasized the fact that the Swiss traditions were very much in line with those of the Council of Europe. And he called for us all to remain faithful to the principles of freedom and to respect democracy, and he indicated that that is one of the things that could be described as a hallmark of Switzerland. It is natural for Switzerland to be part of the Council of Europe, and he said that it was sad that Switzerland had not been there until that date. The fact that it was there was a cause for celebration. Today, 60 years later, I can tell you that the Swiss delegation to PACE is filled with joy in welcoming you here to the Swiss Parliament, to the Palais Fédéral. We're here to work for 2 days, to talk about democracy. Democracy, which is part of the bedrock, not just of the institutions of the Council of Europe, but also of Switzerland. And one of the key elements of democracy is, of course, the organization of free and fair elections. How can we ensure that we have free and democratic elections even in times of crisis, even in difficult times? Just over a year ago, as we emerged from COVID, that was the question many people were asking. But we have had many more crises since then. Wars, natural disasters, sad to say, crisis after crisis, as well as challenges related to the development of our world, thinking especially about the digital era and the development of AI. All of these are matters that we will be dealing with over the next 2 days. This then is a very timely conference. And in opening it, I am delighted to welcome a number of eminent persons who are here with us. And I would like to begin by giving the floor to Mr. Martin Candinas, who is the President of the Swiss National Council, the Swiss Parliament. It's a bit funny for me to be giving you the floor, sir, because usually you're the one in the chair and you're the one who gives me the floor if I want to speak during a debate. So I'll try to do it as well as you do when you give people the floor, and I'll do it in your mother tongue, which is our fourth national language, our valuable and precious fourth language, Romansh. This is a very beautiful ancient...
Signor Martin Candinas, President del Conseil National.
Head of the Swiss delegation for the Council of Europe, dear Damien, President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, dear Madam Chair of the Venice Commission, President of the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities, dear colleagues from the different national parliaments, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Swiss Federal Assembly, I'd like to wish you all a very warm welcome to Bern. It is both an honour and a pleasure for me to welcome you to our Parliament, all the more so as today marks the 60th anniversary of Switzerland's accession to the Council of Europe, almost to the day. Switzerland plays a special role in the European landscape. There is no doubt that Switzerland, at the heart of the continent, shares its values. These are values that unite us and values that we defend together: democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Unfortunately, this anniversary is not the only reason why the timing of this conference on elections in times of crisis is apt. Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes we use superlatives and terms such as crisis or catastrophe in a somewhat cavalier manner. A crisis, well, that is a difficult situation or time which can often be dangerous. It's also a reversal of the status quo. But when we say today that we are in times of crisis, this is unfortunately not an exaggeration, but it's a simple statement. War, crises and disasters have become our daily reality. The refugee crisis, the euro crisis, the pandemic, the earthquake in Turkey and Syria, the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine, and the climate crisis. Europe is no stranger to crises, disasters and wars. They are part of our history, a history full of dramatic and painful events that shaped us for generations, and history that has led brave women and men to work for peace, to work for the rule of law and to work for human rights, and to prevent conflicts, or at the very least, to alleviate the terrible consequences of them. The Council of Europe and its work are an essential part of this commitment. Democracy, human rights, and the rule of law are a bulwark against tyranny, violence, and injustice. A bulwark whose foundation stone was laid 75 years ago by the Council of Europe. This community of values has guaranteed our continent and the 676 million Europeans a life in relative security, justice and peace. My generation and those that have followed have grown up with the supposed certainty that peace and stability and that our democratic institutions are unshakable. I say this not with pride, but with infinite gratitude and with great humility. It is with a huge degree of shock that we've had to realize in recent years just how fragile the security is. We've realized that democracies and their institutions must be nurtured, sustained and protected. The basic framework of our democracies is free and fair elections. In many European states, electoral mechanisms and institutions have become so well established and well practiced after World War II that we no longer perceive them as the extraordinary achievements that they really are. Ladies and gentlemen, no, elections alone are no guarantee for a functioning democracy. But a democracy has no legitimacy without elections. Free and fair elections are an indispensable means for citizens to express their opinions and to be able to make decisions. Crises, disasters and wars raise challenges for organisers of elections, to which there are sometimes still no very clear answers. Innovations, especially of a technological nature, promise answers. They promise new, more representative forms of voting. But can they deliver on their promises in the longer term? Today and tomorrow, you will join your colleagues and eminent experts in the field to discuss the challenges and impact of crises on elections, and also to define measures that can strengthen the resilience of democratic institutions. I wish you interesting and fruitful discussions and thank you for your engagement. Thank you very much indeed.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, pour vos mots.
Thank you, President. Thank you for those words and thank you for the warm welcome. Here we are in this wonderful room, and it's a great pleasure to welcome so many people here. Today, we are now going to hear from Mr. Tini Cox, the President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, who has honoured us with his presence, and I wish to extend warm wishes to him. We have 3 birthdays to celebrate today. We may be 3 days later, but happy birthday, Tini. You now have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, cher Damien. Und danke sehr, Herr Präsident, lieber Martin. Dear President of the Swiss National Council, honourable guests and participants, I see a lot of faces that I do know in this beautiful hall. It is a great pleasure and to open this parliamentary conference on elections in times of crisis and welcome all the participants. It's also a great honour and a pleasure for the Parliamentary Assembly to be associated with the National Council of Switzerland on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of its accession to the Council of Europe. I think that this conference could not be more timely. Our continent has faced, as it was already mentioned, consecutive crises ranging from a pandemic to a war in the heart of Europe, which have been crash tests for our parliaments and our democratic institutions, striving to find the right balance between emergency situations and respect of our fundamental freedoms. The Parliamentary Assembly has prepared many reports on these difficult issues and has observed many elections in the past years on the spot. The presence of many and various stakeholders today, whether politicians, experts or practitioners, is very promising for our upcoming discussions today and tomorrow, I think. Today's conference is taking place under the auspices of the Council of Europe, which has played, over the years, a leading role in election matters on the European continent and beyond. A contribution of members of the Parliamentary Assembly, a Congress of local and regional authorities, the Venice Commission, the Deputy Secretary General of the Council of Europe and the Directorate General for Democracy of the Council of Europe, which is cooperating with many election management bodies throughout Europe, is a clear sign of our organisation, that our organisation is fully engaged to check and promote at each and every stage of what we call the Council of Europe electoral cycle, the necessary conditions to ensure free and fair elections you refer to, Mr. President. Free and fair elections are an essential element of the concept of democracy, a concept to which all member states of the Council of Europe have committed themselves by ratifying the Statute of Europe's oldest and broadest treaty and peace organisation. I'm glad to see that these efforts are supported and shared by our partners in election observation, the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE, the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, the European Parliament, and numerous non-governmental organizations. Dear participants, we will have the chance to discuss here many major issues which have impacted positively or negatively electoral processes in these last years. This conference is not only a moment to reflect about what we achieved so far in terms of standards and democratic practices, it also looks at new challenges. For example, as it was mentioned by the President, new technologies. They are promising, but also prone to allow interference in electoral processes, especially during electoral campaigns. The need to uphold democratic standards throughout Europe will also be at the agenda of the heads of state and government of our 46 member states next week. On the eve of the Reykjavik summit, let me raise a few issues and questions that we should try to address when dealing with current challenges. First, how solid and resilient are our institutions to ensure proper and periodic conduct of electoral processes, especially in times of crisis and conflicts? How strong are they to respect freedom of expression and of the press, freedom of assembly and association in these times of crisis? We all know that this is far more than just an academic question. Second, how well prepared are we to deal with cyber attacks on elections and take countermeasures and sometimes restrictions that respect the principle of necessity and proportionality? And thirdly, how could the Council of Europe and other international organizations best put our expertise and resources at the disposal of especially the state and the people of Ukraine to restore its society, including the possibilities to organize proper electoral processes in times the country is victim of Russia's brutal war of aggression? Let me conclude by recalling that the Council of Europe has a wide range of tools that our member states can trigger to ensure and implement the best electoral standards and practices, ranging from the European Convention of Human Rights to the invaluable standards and guidelines established by the Venice Commission or the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime. Our national parliaments bear an important responsibility in providing legal frameworks compatible with our core values and oversighting its implementation. And may I, again, at the eve of the Reykjavik summit, underline the role of the Committee of Ministers to check whether member states do live up to their obligations to uphold democracy. Perhaps we can discuss during these 2 days, in this conference, how the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe could engage into a more effective dialogue with the Parliamentary Assembly on how to follow up the many relevant reports of the international elections observation missions in which our Assembly participates together with the organizations represented here as well. That could be a major step forward. We do not produce reports to have reports, we do produce reports to be followed up. To conclude, I would like to thank all panelists and all parliamentarians for their participation in this conference, and again our Swiss colleagues for the outstanding cooperation and hospitality. I'm quite convinced that this conference will be another milestone on the road to Reykjavik and a push factor for our future activities in the field of elections. I wish us all, 2 fruitful days of discussions and exchange. Thank you very much. The conference is open.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Tini, President of the Parliamentary Assembly. I thank you for being here with us, and you have certainly encouraged us in our work. You've reminded us that what we do here will have some kind of tangible impact. That's what it's all about, so thank you for that. It's now a pleasure to give the floor to Madame Claire Bazzi-Mallory. She's the President of the Venice Commission and a member of the French Constitutional Court. As you know, the Venice Commission has a central role to play in defending the values of the Council of Europe. And I very much hope that heads of state and government will emphasize that further in their discussions in Reykjavik next week, especially when it comes to defending democracy. So welcome, Madam. You have the floor.
Monsieur le Président du Conseil national,
President of the National Council, President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, President of the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities of the Council of Europe, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honour for me to address you today on the occasion of this parliamentary conference on elections in times of crisis, challenges and opportunities. First and foremost, I wish to thank representatives of the Swiss National Council and representatives of the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly. I thank them for having taken the initiative of organising this important conference on a very timely and significant issue. Ladies and gentlemen, in recent years, the Venice Commission has particularly focused on new challenges relating to the state of emergency. It goes without saying that the COVID-19 pandemic had something to do with that. But there are other viruses that circulated alongside COVID-19, in particular abuse of state of emergency. The Venice Commission has drafted a report on respect for democracy, human rights and the rule of law during states of emergency. They have also drafted a report on measures taken in member states of the EU in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis and the impact of those measures on democracy, the rule of law and fundamental rights. The former of those reports emphasises that the ultimate objective of any state of emergency should be that of allowing a state to overcome the emergency and as quickly as possible to return to normality. Further, a state of emergency should be subject to a number of conditions. Respect for the rule of law, including in particular, but not being limited to, the principle of legality, necessity, proportionality, the temporary nature of any measures introduced, monitoring, both parliamentary and judicial, that has to be effective, predictability of emergency legislation, and fair and transparent cooperation among state institutions. A state of emergency should not be declared in anything other than truly exceptional circumstances, and it should be based on juridical rules. It is also appropriate within the judicial system of a state of emergency to draw a distinction between the institution of exceptional powers and their application. Why do we have so many reservations and precautions? Well, let's be realistic. A state of emergency creates an imbalance within the functioning of institutions, and the scales tip in favour of the executive. That means it can be fertile ground for drifts towards authoritarianism, including all kinds of restrictions on fundamental rights. Legislation on a state of emergency, as far as possible, should be adopted when there is not actually a state of emergency, should make it possible to prevent such slippage, particularly by guaranteeing the role of legislative and judicial powers. We have indeed seen cases in which an emergency has been used, and may sometimes still be used, as a pretext for methods or policies to be used that deviate considerably from the standards that we promote. There is clearly a risk of procedures being misused in the face of insecurity, if that is believed to be growing, and that is something that can indeed lead to weakening of democracy. That being so, the Venice Commission has repeatedly recalled the fact that national security and public safety can only be effectively guaranteed if there is a democratic system that fully respects the rule of law. Ladies and gentlemen, when we come to elections, then there is no exception whatsoever to the principles that I have just outlined. The fundamental principles of electoral law, as affirmed stated in Article 3 of the first additional protocol to the ECHR, and as further developed in the Code of Good Practice in Electoral Matters drafted by the Venice Commission, these things must be respected even when there is a state of emergency. For that reason, many countries do not allow elections to be held during a state of emergency, or at any rate, they do not allow elections to be held in certain particularly serious emergency situations. However, elections must be held as soon as possible after the end of a state of emergency. What does that mean? It means as soon as it is possible for the electoral process as a whole to align with the aforementioned principles. Today, we need to find solutions, sometimes innovative solutions, to the challenges and crises that we face. However, I believe it's important to emphasize that each and every situation must be looked at individually and with great caution. For that reason, the Venice Commission cooperates with other bodies and services within the Council of Europe in looking at how elections might be held in Ukraine when martial law is lifted in accordance with the standards of the Council of Europe. I am convinced that the role of the Venice Commission and the Council of Europe more broadly is that of ensuring that these norms and values are always respected, no matter what the circumstances. I would therefore here like to appeal for us all to bear in mind the need to abide by these principles, and I call upon us all to do that throughout this conference and beyond. I am sure that this meeting will help us to find appropriate, balanced responses to the difficult issues that we encounter in times of crisis. Thank you for your kind attention. Thank you very much, Madam. I think what you have said is particularly important, especially today, because we feel that we're in a permanent crisis situation in our societies today, one crisis upon another. And you have reminded us of the framework that we operate in, and that's very important. Thank you for being here, and thank you for what you said. And lastly, it's my pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Lendert Verbeek, who is the President of the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities. We are delighted to have you with us here today to see that the Congress is represented here, because the local and regional dimension is important also when it comes to elections. And as you know, decentralization of power is something that is very dear to the heart of any Swiss. And indeed, if you look around this room, you can see the symbols of the many cantons that we have in Switzerland. You also see the flags of the different cities. If you look up, you can see them. And I think that these symbols remind us of just how important local and regional democracy is to us. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Distinguished presidents and members of parliament, experts and commissioners, dear ladies and gentlemen, or maybe I should say dear colleagues, because we're all colleagues in this room, I think. I would like to thank the Swiss Parliament and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe for the organization of this important conference on elections in times of crisis, here in this majestic hall of the Swiss Federal Assembly in Bern, as you just explained. And Bern feels very familiar to me. Almost a year ago, in the beginning of May 2022, I undertook an official visit to Switzerland, and it's a pleasure to not only return to this city on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of the Swiss accession to the Council of Europe, but also to see so many familiar faces here today. However, it's not only the Swiss authorities with whom the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities shares a long history of good cooperation. This conference perfectly represents the wide range of notable partners and actors with whom the Congress has a strong relationship, not only, but particularly in the field of elections. In this regard, I would also like to warmly greet our close partners from the Venice Commission, the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights of the OSCE, as well as several current and former members of our Congress. We are here today to discuss and highlight a topic that is well-timed and the importance of which cannot be stressed enough. Recent times have shown that crisis situations can occur in all forms and at any time. Whether we look at the worrying resurgence of armed conflicts, the repeated impacts of climate change and natural disasters, the considerable consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, or newly emerging challenges with regard to cybersecurity or digitalization. We are constantly looking for new practical solutions to unprecedented situations. This presents a challenge not only for us as individuals, but for the entire democratic functioning of our society. Alongside human rights and the rule of law, democracy is one of the three pillars of the Council of Europe. And democracy, as history has taught us, is inconceivably without universal, equal, free, secret and direct elections which allow for legitimacy and trust through voter participation. But what if the one or several stages of the electoral cycle are severely impaired, or the holding of elections is even made impossible due to a major crisis situation? When confronted with a crisis, governments, in particular at local and regional level, have to ask themselves the central question of whether or not to hold elections, always aware of the possible consequences of their postponement. But it doesn't end there. Decision makers have to anticipate additional challenges, such as implications of a crisis situation on the electoral campaign, obstacles with regard to voter registration, or difficulties in the practical organization of the election day itself. And, as if this were not enough, the entire evaluation has to be conducted against the backdrop of imminent threats to the safety, health and ultimately to the life of the voters. Recently we saw the attack on the mayor of Istanbul, Mr. Imamoglu, as an example, which I condemn very strongly. Local and regional authorities are often under immense pressure during times of emergencies, as they are at the forefront of coping with the repercussions of crisis situations. We've seen many examples in the past. While some countries, such as France, for the first round of the 2020 local elections at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, have decided in favor of in-person elections despite practical difficulties. Other countries, such as Germany in 2020 or Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1996, have relied partly or exclusively on remote voting methods for local elections. But not only a pandemic may influence elections, as we witnessed just recently in Turkey, where the devastating earthquakes sparked a discussion on the timing and condition of the national elections, which will take place this weekend. In September 2020, without yet knowing of the unprecedented scope of the pandemic, our Congress adopted a report on local and regional elections in major crisis situations to address the difficulties with which authorities at the local and regional level were facing. I am particularly happy to see that the rapporteur of this report, Mr. Stuart Dixon, is sitting here in front of me, who is also the Vice President of the Council for Democratic Elections of the Council of Europe, will join us on a panel this afternoon. Mr. Dixon's report in 2020 presented the first comprehensive document prepared by the Council. While the report was drafted in the context of the pandemic, it recognizes that not all electoral standards can be applied in the event of a major crisis, whatever its roots may be. It stresses, however, and this is what we need to keep in mind in our discussions, that a core of electoral principles has to be upheld in order to allow for elections to be meaningful, and to enjoy the trust of the voters. For over 30 years, the Congress has observed local and regional elections in the Council of Europe member states. Paradoxically, when they are needed most, election observers face the greatest challenges to their work, which is particularly true for crisis situations. Hence, it remains crucial that states systematically invite delegations to observe elections under all circumstances, to monitor the application of our common standards and principles, and to guarantee the fundamental rights of citizens. After 18 years, the Council of Europe will hold its fourth summit of heads of state and government next week in Reykjavik to reflect on its mission in the light of the new threats to democracy and human rights. And I believe that if the act of conveyance of the fourth summit, or the organization of this conference for that matter, are to show us one thing, and it's this: while we do not have all the solutions to newly emerging challenges yet, major crises can present and must be seen as an opportunity to foster cooperation, to gather experience, and to move forward together, stronger and better, to renew the conscience of Europe. Dear colleagues, throughout the next 2 days we will have the unique chance to exchange with experts from all over Europe on how to best approach and deal with elections in times of major crisis situations. Let's use this opportunity to share knowledge, to reflect on previous experiences, and to learn from each other. Major crisis situations force us to adapt to new realities and to identify different ways forward. It's our duty to make sure we succeed in preserving our democratic institutions and fundamental rights of citizens throughout this process. I thank you for your attention and look forward to this conference and many fruitful exchanges. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, for also insisting on the importance of fair and free elections also on the local and the regional level. It really fits with the national level, and we think it's also a very important matter. That brings us to the end of our opening ceremony, but I want to conclude with one information. Elections, it's about organizing election. It's also about the observation of election. So let's see if we are good observers, because sometimes you can have a beautiful landscape and think that everything is okay, but a little detail doesn't fit. If you look at the beautiful landscape that we have here, actually it's the Rütli, the place where Switzerland was founded with the alliance of the three first cantons of Uri, Schwyz and Unterwald. If you look at this landscape, you might see some detail. You can observe it during these 2 days. The painter was a joker. He made a joke. Apparently it's because this building has been inaugurated on the 1st of April 1902. So there is a fish somewhere you wouldn't think to see a fish. So you can observe this beautiful landscape during the next 2 days. And at the closing ceremony, we will see if you are good observers and if you can find the fish. That brings us to the end of this opening moment of this conference of Bern. Thank you very much to all 4 guests who just spoke to us. Thank you very much. We will take some few seconds. Some of the speakers have to leave the room now, and we will then start with the first session of our meeting. Thank you very much. Oui, c'est plus difficile quand c'est derrière. Now everyone is looking at the fish. You might see an angel too. Dear colleagues, we open now this first session. on the pandemic and the polls, the impact of COVID-19 on elections. When I joined the Council of Europe a little bit less than 4 years ago, my more experienced colleagues told me the observation of elections is one of the best things we do at the Council of Europe. And they were right. We do many interesting and useful things, I hope useful things, but observing elections is one of the best. It's very concrete, it's very immediately useful, and it's very much in the defense of the core values of the Council of Europe and other organizations who are present here today. So I'm very glad that we take these 2 days together with several important partner organizations to look in detail at the challenges facing this important type of mission of ours. When we were first contacted by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, beginning of last year, to organize this conference in Bern, the main topic was the impact of a disruptive event like the pandemic of the COVID-19 on elections and on political campaigns. The Swiss delegation immediately accepted the idea to organize such an event in Bern because we thought, yes, we have all witnessed how strongly the pandemic changed in many ways. The way how we can conduct a campaign, how the ballot day is organized, and how it's possible for us to observe elections. Well, since then, unfortunately, other important topics like how to organize an election during a war or in the context of a war, or after an important natural catastrophe, have unfortunately also emerged. And questions like the impact of digitalization and artificial intelligence on elections and on campaigns have not lost their importance, not at all, quite the contrary. Our conference will come to these important points later today and tomorrow. But now we will come back to the pandemic and its impact, a huge impact on democratic rights, on fundamental rights and freedoms, and discuss the lessons that we can learn from this event. To lead the discussion throughout the 2 days conference, where is he? Here. We will have the pleasure to have the expert support of David Eads. He's chief presenter at BBC. Thank you, David, for being with us and helping us to organize an interesting discussion. And for this first panel, this first session, we have the pleasure to greet several international experts. Dr. Massimo Tomasoli, he's a director, welcome sir, he's the director of global programs and permanent observer for International Institute for Democracy and International and Electoral Assistance, International IDEA, to the United Nations. We have Erik Holm-Øyvik, I hope I pronounce it correctly. He is professor of law at the University of Bern in Norway. He is a member of the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe, and he can bring us also the legal perspective of the Venice Commission in this matter. We have Alexander Perlinski. He is secretary at the Central Commission of the Republic of Moldova. Welcome too. He can bring us maybe the view of a practitioner of organizing ballots and also in times of crisis and of a pandemic. We have Matteo Mecacci. Welcome, sir. He's director of the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights at OSCE, ODIHR. And he will also bring us the perspective of a well-known observer. And we have Mr. Roberto Montella. Welcome, sir. He's Secretary General of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, and so also here it's an important institution in the observation of election. And I may say, when I'm taking part to an observation of election, if I have read the analysis of the legal framework and constitutional framework by the Venice Commission and the political brief of OSCE ODIHR on the campaign and the political situation in the country, then I have all the elements I need to be active in this observation of elections. So thank you for this, and it underlines the importance of the work that the organizations are doing. So thank you for being here. We are glad to hear from you, and David will now take the lead of the discussion. Thank you.
Damien, thank you very much indeed for opening the conference, for laying out the situation for the next 2 days, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. I should say, when you step into the UK Parliament, as you all well know, you step into a bear pit, and Bern has the common sense to put the bear pit on the other side of town, and we're left with this gorgeous assembly with light, what's more, light coming into the room, which has a purpose here, because just before I turn to our panel, I'd like to give you an idea as to how these sessions will run. Because it needs to be inclusive, and we want to hear from you. So while I will address my first thoughts to the panel, and we will have a discussion, we have a number of interventions coming from you from the floor, but we'll also have a question and answer opportunity where you might want to draw on your own experiences related to each topic. So please do forget about the fish and focus on some of the key issues that affect you and affect indeed all of us over the course of the next day and a half. As Damien said, we're starting on a topic which, of course, each and every one of us can say very directly we've been affected by one way or another, and the timing could hardly be more propitious given the WHO has finally closed the door on it being a pandemic. So let's try and get some ideas to what the many lessons are in that respect. And Massimo, I'm going to start with you. You've pulled together a vast piece of work on the effect of COVID on our electoral processes across the member states of the Council of Europe. So give us a snapshot, if you can, of where we stand.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for inviting International IDEA at this meeting. Yes, we just published the report together with the Election Integrity Project, and this is the front cover. It's about elections during emergencies and crises, because we want to draw lessons from the pandemic that go beyond the pandemic and may be relevant for other global crises as well, as some of the speakers actually said in the beginning. I think that the main lesson that we may draw from this book, that is based on 26 case studies and 8 thematic chapters, is that the pandemic has been a stress case, a stress test for democracies under stress. And most of the analysis before 2019 about trends in democracy was about democratic backsliding. So what did the pandemic do in general, and not only with respect to electoral processes? It exacerbated challenges and threats that pre-existed the pandemic itself, and also it created new ones. But it pointed also at some possible innovative ways of coping with that, and we have to build on that. The main message of the publication is that we should build resilient systems in order to protect the integrity of electoral processes and democracy at large. And if you want, I can get a little bit more into the details, but I think you want to be more interactive. So I can tell, for example, that the quality of elections was undermined in many countries during the pandemic, and these had to do with issues that have been raised already. For example, it closed or reduced the space for electoral contestation, reduced opportunities for electoral participation, and in some cases even it led to disenfranchisement of voters. It raised many electoral management difficulties, legal conflicts, and also it reduced the opportunities for international scrutiny of elections and impacted on international and domestic election observation. For example, restrictions or even prevention imposed on the organization of in-person events versus unrestricted campaign activities of the ruling party in Zambia. It's a concrete case. Lower turnout, which was experienced both at the national and subnational electoral levels. In the period between the 11th of March 2020 to the 31st of December 2021, turnout declined by 4.1% at national contests and by 6% at local elections. Well, there was also strain on very, I would say, weak, in some cases, electoral systems in terms of resources and finances available because of the diversion of public funding towards other priorities. So insufficient resources was also another major issue. Disputes about the constitutionality of elections, of whether to hold or postpone them, and you heard already about the French example, for example. Reduced scrutiny of elections actually confronted the international election observer actors with very few options, either to do it in person or do it by proxy, by using foreign nationals who are present in the country, or doing it remotely, or a combination of these, and eventually not doing it at all. And I think that a major element is also about what changed for the better. And I think examples here are safety guidelines and equipment, and greater resilience of systems and inter-agency cooperation between different agencies that deal with issues that before were not so closely associated, like public health and electoral processes, for example, in New Zealand, in Argentina. The special voting procedures, innovations in allowing citizens to express their vote without being exposed to the risk of getting the disease. And in fact, this is the way forward for us. We are now working on another major publication on special voting arrangements.
So we've got a whole panoply of issues, many of them challenges, one or two plus sides as well, which we can draw out in the course of this panel discussion. Eric, you'll relate very directly to some of the points that Massimo was making, but you can bring us also a Norwegian perspective.
Yes, thank you. I will just make one general observation first, and then I will come back to the Norwegian example. Well, in very short, what Massimo said, the Venice Commission perspective, being an advisory body for lawmaking and constitution making, is regulated in advance. So the Venice Commission recommends a rule of law approach to emergencies in general, and also holding elections during emergency. And this rule of law approach is explained in a report titled Respect for Democracy, Human Rights and the Rule of Law during States of Emergency, which was adopted in June 2020 in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this report sets out the principles for governing a state of emergency, including elections, while maintaining the rule of law. And to be clear, the rule of law does not prevent states from deviating from the ordinary system of government and its limitations in order to manage an emergency, be it a public health emergency, natural disasters, terrorism, or war. But, and as mentioned by the President of the Venice Commission in our introduction, there are some general principles that do apply when emergency measures requires exceptions from the system of government and individual rights, including electoral rights. And these are necessity, proportionality, temporariness, effective parliamentary and judicial scrutiny, predictability of emergency legislation, and finally, loyal cooperation among state institutions. And I reiterate these principles because they are very important. Now, in the context of elections, these principles means that states should stick with the normal procedures as far as possible, even in the face of practical difficulties. Normal election procedures can be made more resilient to emergencies. For example, an electoral system that permits advance voting or postal voting over an extended period is less vulnerable than systems where all voting is done on one election day. Nonetheless, an emergency may require the election to be postponed, extended, or to have special measures during the campaign and voting period in order to ensure free and fair elections for candidates and voters. And therefore, the Venice Commission has consistently recommended that states regulate in advance the conditions and criteria for holding, prolonging, and postponing elections during an emergency. And to prevent time pressures and excesses, legislation on emergency measures should be drafted and adopted during normal times. And this is what the Venice Commission calls the rule of law approach to emergencies. And therefore, with the COVID-19 pandemic fresh in mind, now is the time for legislators to act, to prepare their electoral legal framework for future emergencies. We have now seen a great natural legal experiment, or a stress test, as Massimo called it, which provides an opportunity to improve electoral systems. And that is my key observation, and then I will return later on with other issues.
Yeah, thank you very much, because we do want to know a little bit more about what you can do immediately, what you have to do after the event, and I know you can reflect on that. Alexandra, thank you very much for being with us. Moldova did go through the process, not once but twice, of elections during COVID. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, David. Yes, indeed, the Republic of Moldova has organized 2 national elections. It was in 2020 when we had organized the presidential election, and after that we had early parliamentary election in 2021. So back in 2020, all the states around the world have been seriously faced with the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition to significant public health concerns, it has created problems in the organization and conduct of elections. One of the general issues was the conduct of election and ensuring the constitutional right to vote in the context of the pandemic while maintaining voter safety and minimizing public health risk. These are the aspects that the Electoral Commission had to think about the most when organizing the electoral process, seeking a balance between democratic rights and health risk. In a few minutes, I will share with you our experience in 2020, the presidential election. We have multiple challenges, but I am sure that all our colleagues around the world have the number one challenge was to minimize the physical contact, but at the same time keep them in touch. And I'm talking about the polling station workers, observer, electoral contestants, the person that was involved in electoral campaigns. One of the challenges was for us as Electoral Commission was the training of the electoral officials, because when we are talking about election in Moldova, you should consider that it's around 2,000 polling stations and 2.8 million of voters. All the polling workers are nominated by the parliamentary political parties and the local council, and all these persons must be trained that what it means that an electoral process. When we are talking about electoral polling workers, we are talking about 25,000 of persons. So all these persons must be trained in a short period of time, but at the same time we have to train them without get that physical contact. What we have done? We use different online platforms like Skype, Zoom, Teams, including different educational videos uploaded on YouTube or Facebook. About legal framework, we had a regulation that was adopted about the state of emergency situations, and this draft of regulation was elaborated by the CSC. In this legal framework was described the rules for the voters, the rules for the electoral poll workers, the rules for the electoral contestants and and the rules for the person that was involved in the electoral campaign. It was a very, very good fixed in this one.
Sorry to interrupt. Did that affect the way in which people could vote then? I mean, you could bring that into law straight away.
Yes, another challenge for us, it was to convince the voters that the polling station is a safe place. Everyone could come and vote, and to minimize the risk to infection to COVID-19. At the beginning, when we start organizing this election, our concern was that we will not to reach that turnout to validate the election. According with the turnout, it was like a very good turnout. In the first round, it has more than 50% in the first round, and the second round, the turnout reached the 54 or 55% of the voters.
Where is that compared to the previous election? I mean, is that up or down, or?
It was like the same turnout. Okay. Yes.
So no great loss in turnout there.
No.
Okay.
It was.
Thank you, Alex. We'll hold it there for a moment because I think the points you're making about remote working come right into Matteo and Roberto's laps and making sure that the system is working. Matteo, for observers in particular of elections, this is D-Day for disaster, isn't it? I mean, if you're not there on the ground, what on earth are you going to do?
Yeah, definitely. But let me start also by thanking the Swiss Parliament for the invitation, the colleagues from the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and all the partners organizations, including civil society representatives who are here with us. We really appreciate the opportunity to be together. Indeed, and as you have mentioned, David, just days ago, the WHO has declared the pandemic over. So if we look back now, I think we have a lot, maybe a little bit of calm to think what we can learn from this experience. Now it's over 3 years. And as we were looking through the numbers, the pandemic was declared in March 2020. And for us, as you said, it was a little bit of a D-Day because, as you know, the issue of election observation, especially in an organization like the OSCE, where there is a strong commitment on these values by all participating states, but they are not the same views among all members of the organization. So it has always been questioned in the way it is conducted when it comes, for example, to election day monitoring. Some countries have been saying that you do not need to have observers on the ground for election day, that maybe you can do it remotely. So in a way, that was also a threat to the idea of election observation as such. But I must say that I'm very proud that ODIHR was immediately aware of these scenarios, this environment, and we were able to deploy in a slightly different format the first election observation already in May 2020. So we were the first international organization which restarted election observation. This was done in Serbia, which was then followed by North Macedonia. And it was important to give the signal that we were ready to work and to continue. Of course, this requires the participation of countries, because we can deploy, and we are talking about logistically, sometimes 300, 400, for example, observers, which, for example, this weekend are going to be deployed with our colleagues in Turkey. And you have to make sure that these people are safe, these people have access in the country, and are able also to travel freely, which was one of the limitations which were imposed throughout the world for also obvious and objective reasons, not related to political limitations. So overall, I must say that we have seen a positive response by the very vast majority of participating states, but in a few cases we have seen some attempts to try to undermine the whole process of election observation by either sending invitations too late for us to be able to deploy, or by trying to limit the number of observers that can be deployed. And this is also an issue which has been politically charged for a long time, on which we had to stay strong and push back on these attempts.
Let me take that on to Roberto, actually, because I think that's what Madame Mallory was calling the détournement de procédure, an effort to backslide, as well as Massimo said. I wonder what your experiences have been, Roberto, over the covering of elections.
Thanking the host is a given normally, but I will take a second, I know sometimes we take too much time in thanking those who have hosted you, but I'd like to take a second to thank the Swiss Parliament for inviting us here, and President Cox and the Spina for collecting all our assemblies. All our assemblies work together very much in election observation. Yesterday we had a meeting of electoral experts of the ODIHR, the Council of Europe, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. There is also the Secretary General of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly here. And it's very good that we do this normally before the parliamentarians coming into the play, because the experts really try to, at the working level, to create synergies and work with the methodology that the ODIHR has developed in this year, and strengthen that methodology in order to make us deliver a better product. Our final statements is the product of election observation missions, so we have to focus on what is the end goal of our efforts. And also, just a note, as an Italian who was born in Switzerland, it gives me a great honor to speak in the Swiss Parliament. But the impact of COVID, we didn't observe elections immediately like ODIHR did. It took us 5 months before we started again. We started in Montenegro in August 2020, and then we managed to deploy 2 missions with a great number of observers in Georgia and in the United States, back to back. So it was very difficult, and some members of parliament I see here, Vice President Lopatka, who is also a member of the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE, PA, who traveled to Georgia and then to the United States. The United States, as Matteo said, it's very important that then the countries who are hosting an observation mission during COVID make an effort. When we went to the US, it was impossible to travel to the US. There were very few flights, and the US wasn't accepting any foreigners. They made an exception. They called us our mission a mission of national interest, thus allowing observers to come. So the impact of COVID has been, I'd say, yes, the introduction of new technologies. I think we have the biggest impact, I would say, is one on costs. We have had huge costs because we've had to, for social distancing, taking bigger rooms for our briefings. And I would say politically, the biggest impact has been on the Russian Federation side. They've tried to impose or maybe abuse the excuse of COVID to say that the numbers of observers had to be reduced. Together with the ODIHR, we do not accept, of course, that the host country decides the number of observers.
Sorry, but I get the point about costs for maybe PPE and that sort of provision. But if you've got fewer observers going out and you're doing more remotely, isn't that a very cost-effective way of operating?
Well, the challenge here has been that there is no less observers, at least from our parliamentary side, and especially we see now in the post-COVID, the numbers have exponentially grown. So also during COVID, probably because it was the only opportunity to travel, many MPs have decided to travel. So, and the costs is because during COVID, especially, we had to have a larger conference rooms for social distancing, also the tests, and now the costs have increased also because in the post-COVID and with inflation, all the costs of travel, conference room, which is our line of work, have increased. So cost is a big challenge, and of course here we have members of parliament who have, let's say, the hand on the purse. So we also call on to them to make sure that the necessary funds are put into election observers.
Alexandra, for you, for a country, costs of course come into play alongside public safety. How did you manage, and did you experience the same sort of pain of financial pain, if you like?
Yes, of course. We are talking about all the necessary equipment that should be provided for all the polling stations. And another challenge for us for the cost is that Republic of Moldova had opening polling station abroad, outside the country. We had opening 139 polling station abroad. And it was for us, among the cost, it was a big challenge for us to transport all the materials from the country to those polling stations. taking into consideration the flights that was suspended, the problems of crossing borders, and so on and so on. Thanks to our Ministry of External Affairs, everything was very good organized, and we didn't have any problems to deliver all the materials to that polling station and to receive it back.
Did you have any issues about observers in terms of numbers, period of time they could work with you?
No, but Mr. Mikachi could confirm. We had a very good communication with all the national observer, also with the international observer. We have like a interinstitutional group that was taking care of international observers. I'm talking here about the person from the Ministry of Health and some person from the hospital. We had like around 10 cases when the international observers has infected with the COVID, but all the measure was taken care and everything was okay.
So Matteo, what were the fresh elements you're having to look at as an observer team then with COVID?
Well, of course, I just want to confirm that we had excellent relationship with the Central Election Commission in Moldova, with the authorities, and throughout, I would say, the OSCE region. I mean, one element, for example, is when you do the election observation, if you have social distancing measures, you know, the issue was how are going to the observers be together with the election workers in the same room while people are voting to observe. And so these were things that were very difficult to handle and to manage. The question of duty of care, for example, for the international observers, which in our case is a joint effort. Over the year, the OSCE participating states and they are seconding agencies, because these are people who are sent by capitals, and so there is a shared responsibility with the host country to make sure that, for example, medical services would be provided if people got sick. So this required a lot of coordination because it's based on shared responsibility where everyone had to be very, very proactive and cooperative. So these were issues. There are some positive elements, I would say. For example, some of the Central Election Commission, due to the pandemic, started to live stream their session, which first were not, made public. Of course, this does not replace the personal interaction that you want to continue to have, being present on the ground. But for example, this offers an opportunity to have more transparency, as well as the expansion, as it was mentioned before, of the alternative voting methods, whether it's postal voting, in some cases trials of e-voting, which is an issue which has some delicate aspects to look at, but basically providing mobile voting for people who are sick. So there have been some positive elements that can be, I think, mainstream also moving forward.
The point about different voting methods, Eric, at the time of a crisis, I mean, you look at constitutional elements that need to be changed for the future to, if you like, more resilience of a process. So I just want to throw 2 points to you, really. One is, how far can you go at the time in terms of offering up different voting arrangements on the spot that fit within any legal framework? And of course, Norway has taken the constitutional step. I think you co-wrote the procedure for the next step. What are the key points of that? Where have you gone?
Well, that's a good question. Well, the short answer is you can go further than you could in normal times. So, for example, the Venice Commission enforces this one-year rule of fundamental changes to the electoral system, which you shouldn't do within 1 year before the election. Now, if there's a crisis, an emergency, you can go further. We write this in our report. But then you can do a lot of things in advance to make your electoral system more resilient. For example, having an extended voting period or having alternatives in your electoral law, so you don't get surprised when the crisis hits. In Norway, there was a revision of the electoral code started already in 2017, and the mandate for the commission, which I was a part of, was to have emergency rules specific for elections, both in the electoral law and also in the constitution, to postpone, to prolong, or even to have a new election if there's an emergency. And in 2017, I think the motivation for the government was the threat of Russian intervention, because there was a lot of threats at that time, and they had to make last-minute changes due to the fear of Russian intervention. Then, of course, came the pandemic, and this proposed rule came at a convenient time, so it was adopted in the Constitution unanimously. And that allows, if there's an extraordinary event that prevents or is likely to prevent a large portion of the voters to vote, which means you can't have a free and fair election, then 2/3 of all members of the Norwegian Parliament can decide to extend election proceedings with 1 day or postpone the election up to 1 month, as far as necessary, and the scope only as far as necessary. So, in principle, only one polling station, one constituency, if that is where the problems are. If the Parliament can't meet, then the government alone, under the criminal responsibility, can make that decision to extend the proceedings for 1 day or postpone the election for 1 week. And if, after the election, you see that this event has prevented a large portion of voters from voting, which means that the election is not free and fair, then you can have a new election for those affected constituencies by a 2/3 majority in Parliament. And that is the qualified majority requirement is recommended to prevent abuse, of course, to have a most inclusive process as possible. So that is one way of regulating, not as a state of emergency rule in the Constitution, but a specific electoral law rule in the Constitution that targets these very specific situations. And we haven't tested it yet, so but we'll see next time. At least now we're prepared.
Well, how prepared? Can I just ask out here for various countries represented, if you could just raise your hand if there is some constitutional revision or new procedure taking place now post-COVID? We have one hand up over there. Massimo, I throw that out just as a sense of there's quite a lot of people here, quite a lot of countries represented. I guess this is one of the challenges. You know, we've had an event, it's done, people move on.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, we reacted, but now, if you think of the verbs used by Eric, we need to prevent, to be prepared, and to allocate enough time for doing all of these. And once the emergency is perceived as over, these are no longer considered as priorities. But this is the time to act. We provided 11 ideas for reforms in our publication. But if I were to mention 3 out of the 11 that are particularly relevant, one is revising the electoral law to clearly specify the circumstances under which these actions that were ambiguously addressed under the pressure of the height of the emergency should be properly processed. For example, election postponement, which was an issue. Then a second important aspect is providing citizens with alternative voting arrangements. And this requires time because you have to build up a system, defining the normative framework, train those who are supposed to then deliver this public good that is very important, the possibility for citizens to vote without being exposed to a health hazard. And third, I think, another very important element is that there should be a development of cross-party solutions to running elections, so that this is not left to unilateral decisions by governments. And this goes in the direction of dialogue, the role of parliaments, and the possibility of framing a crisis in the perspective of a vision where they will occur. And therefore, we have to be prepared. Therefore, preparedness, not only crisis management, preparedness and prevention are at the core of our policy choices for the future.
Matteo.
Yeah, I think this gives us an opportunity also to introduce a related issue, because what Massimo mentioned, it's always very important, and one key element is about public consultation when it comes to adopting these type of measures. Because if you have a governmental decrees that's going to change some of these measures 2 months before the elections, you're going to undermine public trust. Whether it's the opposition, civil society, the media, there will be questions. So this is the first topic. But
just before the next point, so what sort of time frame do you need to deliver the awareness?
I mean, of course, on these type of things, now that you don't have a crisis, the best time to work on these things. But overall, in general, we always have an issue when elections are approaching, and usually within a year, and we do recommend generally with the Venice Commission also not to make changes to election legislation less than a year in advance to allow, all stakeholders to be aware of the rules of the games. But actually this is happening in many countries, including within Europe, where when the times approaches, there are changes to the electoral law. So this is something which is not related directly to the pandemic, but as a good practice, the idea of having prior public consultation on all election-related issues, even the proportional system or, the threshold, those things needs to be done well in advance with public discussions in Parliament. If not, you're going to, create more tension and undermine trust in the process.
And is that the evidence, actually, of the trust is undermined if it's within a year of an election?
I think it is difficult to draw like, a direct conclusion, but we see that turnout is decreasing throughout the world, I would say. So certainly public trust and public participation is not increasing. Whether this is related, to this specifically or other issues, maybe also there are, of course, displeasure with policies and economic situation, but of course public participation proves where it is applied that you have a better outcome of the whole process.
Of course, yeah.
I just wanted to follow up on turnout and maybe ask our experts if you have done any studies on how was the trend of turnout in major countries up to prior to the pandemic and how it is now, and whether the pandemic has impacted the turnout, because we see it more and more as a problem of public participation in elections. So I don't know if there is any studies on that.
In the Republic of Moldova, actually, we didn't have any major changes about turnout. By the way, last election in 2021, when we are talking about voting from abroad, we have the highest number of voters since Moldova has opening a polling station abroad. We have more than 200,000 of voters that was voting abroad. So when you're talking about the pandemic, actually our turnout did not affect at all.
Okay, briefly, Eric, thank you.
Yeah, I can just mention Norway. We had an election, parliamentary election in September 2021 when there was a spike in the infection rate in Norway, and the turnout was 77%, which is only 1% lower than the last election. And I think that has a great deal to do with the fact that we allow advanced voting for 1 month before election day. So for this election, 57.9% of all voters voted before election day. And that is a huge increase compared to the last election, which means that my initial point, ordinary election systems can be made quite resilient to any kind of disruption. And, if you have a problem with keeping the distance, well, get a bigger room. That is also possible, but you need to prepare your electoral legislation to allow local election administrations to do that. So you need to provide flexibility in case of a crisis.
I get a sense also where there was physical turnout for polling booths, it was an event. There weren't many events going on. People would get out and vote because it was something to do, sadly. But that's a good point. Eric, thank you very much. And I've got a couple of people who are very keen to get involved in the discussion. Before I go there, though, you've been listening to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 men in grey suits. So I think it's important that we change the dynamic a little bit. And we have some parliamentary interventions. So I'd like to ask, first of all, Valentina Grippo of the ALDE. Valentina, for your intervention. Thank you.
Thank you. The situation we had in Italy during the COVID and in the immediate period past the COVID, actually touched most of the arguments that were formally mentioned. Basically, our situation was that in March 2020, we were supposed to vote in 6 major regions in Italy. A huge number of local elections and a very important constitutional referendum that would reduce the number of representatives in the parliament that was before the COVID very popular between the people. In that situation, we had decided to postpone all the elections. And when I say we, I touch a first aspect of what happened, because actually we didn't have a parliamentary discussion or a public discussion on this subject, but we had a decision taken by the president that didn't pass through the parliament. It was just a degree connected with the most important and basic degree on the pandemic situation, and it was decided to postpone all the election at least after the summer. And actually we wouldn't have had election if the constitutional courts wouldn't say that we should do those elections, because there was the referendum, the constitutional referendum that should have been done until a certain amount of days. So this would. So first aspect was not only the fact that we postponed all the election, and the fact that we didn't even consider the idea of introducing some online way of consulting the citizen, as we were doing, defending other constitutional basic rights, not only health rights, but all other rights like education or others. But the fact that this decision was, in a way, taken on a very simple way, that was maybe also perceived by the people as a recognition that that right wasn't so important in the, let's say, hit parade of rights. Yeah. And the effect of this thing, we suppose, because we have some parliamentary studies, is that after the pandemic period, we had a very low numbers in election participation, and also the public discussion around the election appointment has changed. The physical discussion and the online discussion. So this is also a point that would like to address to you.
Interesting. So I'm going to stop you there, if that's okay. But just interesting that those postponements came at a very early stage in COVID, and a critically very challenging time for the country as well. So one can get the sense of state of emergency. Can I also ask Alexander Pociej from Poland? Alexander?
Yes.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Yes, indeed, I'm from Poland, and I would like to share with you one aspect which is probably completely different from the other ones. Normally, our suspicious is that the regime, the government, is going to use the COVID or pandemic moment to postpone, to hold the power longer. And Polish, what happened in Poland, it was completely vice versa. I mean, the whole opposition was asking the government not to organize this election during pandemic time. Why? Because, of course, political aspects, sure. But the responsibility of organizing such an event in pandemic was really, really very dangerous. And I would like to share with you also one thing concerning Bulgaria. I preside the election in Bulgaria, and there all political parties, they agreed to introduce some changes, the possibility of electronic voting. And because it was unanimous on the political scene, so everybody said yes. And they introduced this only 6 or 5 months before the elections. What happened? I mean, the idea itself is very good, because you are just, you have a screen, like in laptop, so you are touching where you want, and immediately the vote is cast. So by the end, you don't have to wait 2 or 3 hours to count all votes, because it's one button. And what happened? People, they started to touch the same screen, which in the pandemic time, this is a disaster. So what they wanted, so the obligation was to clean this with the wax or something like this, and the machine broke down. For 10 minutes, because after using this wax, it was impossible to vote on. So there is, of course, such a, you cannot foresee everything, but I would like to share those two aspects. For me, very interesting, residing from COVID time.
So great idea, smart thinking, innovative, but just practically hadn't been thought through, rushing things. Did you want to comment, Roberto, on that?
Just a general comment on the COVID impact, because we are really analyzing this in and out. But I would say nobody was prepared for COVID. And if we look with some distance, I think the way governments and parliaments and you mentioned coalitions of parties have acted was, I think, as good as it gets, honestly. And I think if we look at from the observers' perspective, I would argue that COVID has made the observers community more, this fashionable word today, resilient. I mean, we have really strengthened our ties, we have strengthened our methodology, we have been very creative in finding ways in order to improve the service we do for members of parliaments when they observe, and also the service we do to host countries when we deliver them a statement on those observations. So I wouldn't be too harsh, let's say, on the consequences of COVID. Also because it was something that we were, navigating in the unknown, and so I would look at it and I would argue that the COVID impact, both on the observers community but also on our parliaments and governments have behaved within the framework of elections, is not that dramatic. Apart from those, of course, and you mentioned regime, who have decided to misuse it. And here, I mean, the Russian Federation did make a point in not allowing observers to be in the numbers that we would have liked to, and we have decided not to observe. So there are those, of course, who are a bit spoilers in this game.
No, plenty of positives within among the challenges. Cécile Lemon, Cécile, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I will be speaking French. Thank you for giving me the floor. Well, in our parliament in Luxembourg, we were told special situation, special measures. And in March 2020, with the virus spreading rapidly, a state of crisis was declared by our government. This has not been included in the report from the Venice Commission, but that's what happened. So for 3 months, we worked on the basis of certain decrees, but we remained in full compliance with our constitution and international treaties. Yes, democracy was shaken a little bit, perhaps, and the role of the Parliament was to some extent compromised, but we weathered the storm. I don't want to make any secret of the fact that when we were discussing adopting what we called this state of crisis in the country, we had a very, very lively parliamentary debate. However, given what happened at that time, and given the rhythm, the pace at which we adopt legislation in Luxembourg, where we have a situation with our State Council that regularly has to give an opinion on legislation, the only thing that we could do in that special situation was to adopt certain special measures, but only for 3 months, and that 3 months was very strictly respected. I think I could also tell you that the plenary chamber of our Parliament was actually moved vote for the whole period of the pandemic. And this is something that's very rare in Luxembourg. I imagine that this move is something that will go down in the annals of history as a truly unique event. I also have to note that no election was foreseen for the period of the pandemic in Luxembourg, and therefore we didn't have to decide on that specific issue. We didn't have to decide whether to hold elections, defer them, or cancel them. If we had decided that we were going to go ahead with elections, it would have been very interesting, especially in a country like ours, where voting is mandatory. You have to vote. So I just wanted to make one further point. At local level, and I'm talking about our communes, our other kinds of districts, at local level, we didn't want to hold up the way the work goes forward. And therefore, we decided that these local bodies could benefit from some slight legislative tinkering, I might say, which allowed them to hold votes remotely. Votes could be sent in writing. Different postal voting systems were set up. So we did do things to help them. I would say that the pandemic restrictions highlighted for us the need to develop other observation and evaluation methods. We need this for elections. I'm thinking now about the situation of election observers. We're now in a post-pandemic period, and it's time to look back and take stock of what we have achieved and what we have learned from what we have lived through, and now to exchange good practices among ourselves. Constitutional powers in emergency situations are one thing, but it's also very important that you have judicial monitoring, and we know that that was directly affected by the pandemic, as was our whole system of election monitoring. Given the overall picture, it's clear that at least in the short term, some things were done that might have infringed the three fundamental pillars of the Council of Europe: democracy, rule of law, and human rights. At least that potential was there. But let me just conclude with one point that I think is not insignificant, at least for Luxembourg. Right now, on the 11th of June, we are going to be holding elections at local level, at commune level, and there will be parliamentary elections, a general election, on the 8th of October this year in Luxembourg. It's going to be very interesting indeed for us to see to what extent the management of the pandemic will have had an impact on the vote and on the choices that our voters make. But that's another story. And it may well be that I'll be able to tell you that other story at the end of the year in person. Who knows?
Thank you very much indeed. Another story, but actually, Massimo, the COVID as the political electoral issue is massive, isn't it? And it will have changed the direction of voters across the piece.
Absolutely. It has established a space for public debate on constitutional rights. And in fact, one of the implications, the longer-term implications, as we have listened to, will not only be in terms of reviewing the electoral normative frameworks, but also to assess the constitutional frameworks. And we can see already the reverberation in the public debate about that. And I think that there is also another aspect, which is the political dimensions of the polarization that started well ahead of COVID and which COVID became a vehicle for. For example, all the debates about the role of science in public decision-making and the importance of having technical advisory boards informing political decisions, the extent to which these space should be protected from extremely polarized public debate to the detriment of facts. Some of the innovations that have been brought about and maybe even strengthened by the reaction to the pandemic carry implicitly also many challenges on the cyber disinformation side. And this is really restructuring the political debate in all our democracies. And I think that we are just learning how to address these. It will change the way we do election campaigns, for example, the shift from in-person to online campaigning. Brings about major challenges, for example, in terms of political finance of election campaigns. To what extent online campaigning is or should be regulated? Who can exercise control on that? These are entirely new fields, arenas of confrontation, where I think we are not yet fully aware of the implications of what has happened.
We'll delve more into that, of course, tomorrow morning as we focus on technology, AI, etc. Thank you very much for that. Now, I'd like to start Ian Paisley from the UK, who'd like to make an intervention.
Thank you very much, David, and can I thank the panellists for their wonderful presentations, very, very thought-provoking. So thank you. Our institutions obviously had emergency procedures as well during the pandemic. I think those procedures actually frustrated debate. Parliamentarians were reduced to making 3-minute monologues for the sake of a press release, as opposed to engaging in serious scrutiny, serious debate. And that has, I think, inhibited Parliament post-pandemic, because with many parliamentarians elected in 2019 who are still in that mode that, oh, this is what Parliament is about, making a statement, as opposed to scrutinising robustly, challenging ideas, engaging in debate and learning from that debate. And I think in any stock take, we really need to examine how we avoid that limitation on scrutiny. I wonder if the panel perceive that institutions are treading very carefully about introducing some changes because of a perception that elites may have an agenda here. We heard the example from Poland, and that any change to the system is about protecting elites and their positions. I wonder if that has flagged up. I hear many people saying we need to do this for young people, or we need to do this for mature people. No party has a monopoly over young people or mature people, and I think we need to look at that. We have a very specific example in the United Kingdom. In the last year, and this is post-pandemic, we had made a very simple change to electoral voting ID. So in my part of the United Kingdom, the Labour Party in 2000 Labour government introduced proper photographic ID. Universally welcomed, it's reduced fraud at elections. Great idea. The current Tory government in England introduced voter ID for local authority elections. Universally condemned by the Labour Party as an attempt to frustrate electioneering. And yet we're sitting in Northern Ireland going, this is really wonderful, it works, and you guys introduced it on us. But I'm wondering if that element of public trust, doing it in such a short period, is really the key point, and having a proper debate on it. And very, very finally, the process of electioneering, to me this is the heart of it. You know, as a politician, I knock doors, I talk to real people, I engage in town hall meetings, I distribute literature during election campaigns, after election campaigns, between election campaigns. Any consideration of the impact on that will have, because the biggest criticism I face as a politician is, oh, we don't see you enough, you're never around our doors or our housing estate or our farms enough. And how do we avoid that being frustrated and our electoral process actually being contaminated by this view? We can do it all remotely. We can do it all over a phone. We need the public engagement with the person beside us to really work.
Briefly, 2 points then. I don't know who would like to address those, gents, but perhaps first of all, the loss of face-to-face. In fact, it's almost a cultural mindset shift towards the online soundbite rather than getting together. I mean, that can be overcome now, presumably. Massimo? Or is it too late? The die is cast?
Well, elections are no different space than education, for example. The same challenge is there. What did you learn when you were a teenager in a school during a lockdown and you had to do everything remotely. And what do you do when you do a campaign online where you have that sort of face-to-face physical interaction that has been at the core of your political engagement style? I think we have to consider society as a whole. There are no separations between all these fields. Think of voter education, for example. That is at the junction between our field of education and the field of political engagement. And you can't do everything online. There are things that I convey here in this room because you watch me that are inherent to the fact that you can be close to me. And this is not happening online. Never will happen online. Actually, it can even be manipulated online.
But it does raise a question about possible re-education of, and I'm not saying young people, but of a younger voter who has already become attuned to a different way of working and indeed of interacting with people. The second point, Eric, I think was about, do you discern some reluctance to make changes precisely to avoid being perceived as politicizing the electoral process?
Yes, and that is a good point, and I think that is a correct observation as well. And I mean, for all these changes to be made, I think we need to emphasize that there should be, you know, a non-partisan, cross-party dialogue and inclusive process. And I think some of the tension may be the fact that some of the changes proposed may be, you know, very significant changes. While useful changes can be made at a much lower level to provide local authorities with more flexibility, adjusting or introducing flexibility that will not have an impact on the election result or campaigning as such, but for example, how, you know, operational decisions on the voting premises, for example, those can be made at a lower level. I mean, if we just move the debate down to the more operational decisions, at least in my mind, there shouldn't be as much controversy than those major changes to the electoral system and so on. I'm not talking about that necessarily, because I think we need to move the issue from being, if you have an emergency, the government should declare a state of emergency, which allows it to curtail individual liberty, etc., and postpone elections. That's at one end of the scale. On the other end of the scale, you have those changes you can make without going to the state of emergency. And it's the state of emergency thinking that really challenges the legitimacy of elections, not those small, low-scale, discrete changes that allows it to run more smoothly in a lower-level crisis, if I can say so.
Good point. Thank you very much. I'm aware of the clock is ticking. We've got a few more who would love to comment in just a moment, Hassan. But first, I'd like to ask Konstantinos Evstatiou to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would point the manipulation factor during the pandemic. And I take advantage of Mrs. Pojek's mention that what happened with the machine in Bulgaria. And I think that the pandemic highlighted the tremendous power of the media, the one who control the media, and you are aware, David, of that issue. Sometimes, not you, but I'm sure that you have witnessed such a situation. Sometimes they exaggerating, sometimes they downgrading the information according to their political beliefs. Also, I had to state also to comment on what Mrs. Mallory from the Venice Commission has stated this morning, that there is always a temptation for the executive when there is the state of emergency. So, coming back to our issue, and take into consideration that even in Ukraine, during the war, the war of aggression of Russia, they have not declared a state of emergency. although they were entitled to do so. So my firm position is that no matter the situation, no matter the crisis, let's do not allow to anybody to manipulate the electoral decision, because election is not only the ballot, it's a whole process dealing with some elementary human rights. So,
okay, I'll take that. I'll have to move on if that's all right. We'll take that, Konstantinos. I just want to throw that to our observers at the end there as well, actually, because part of my understanding is that there is a recognition that on the day doesn't do the job. You want a much longer time frame to do the job, which would actually help to feed into the concerns that Konstantinos is making.
Absolutely. I mean, and also what was mentioned by the Venice Commission President, of course we're talking about elections, but also we look at all other aspects connected to the rule of law, whether the judiciary is functioning, independent institutions which are connected to the enjoyment of rights. So this is not something that you can do. Of course, we are usually present for around 2 months in the country, which gives us a sense of the campaign, but we have to look also at the background and the legislative framework. But just briefly also to the colleague from the UK, about voter enfranchisement in a way, and this question about IDs. If I may say, I mean, this is something that we have seen also in the US, is being debated and being politicized. Our recommendation is that when it comes to voters' rights, the less politicized the issue is, the more you rely on independent institutions that make recommendations according to the rule of law, the better it is. Because the risk is that if these issues are left only to legislators without independent assessment and looking really at the rules, it can really go in the wrong direction. So this is something that is quite delicate.
Good point. Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to Pierre-Alain Frides.
Voilà, je m'exprime en français.
Yes, I'm going to be speaking in French. Welcome to Bern. I'd like to come back to the issue of elections in Russia, held in September 2021. Now, I was appointed head of the electoral observation mission for the Council of Europe. We went to Moscow, there are 40 of us. There are 500 monitors from the OD of the OSCE, but as a result of the pandemic, the numbers allowed by the Russian authorities went down hugely. I think they allowed 40 people from the OSCE and 10 people from the Council of Europe. As I'm sure you know, Russia is a country which has 11 different time zones between St. Petersburg and Vladivostok, and 500 people suddenly arriving in Moscow was something that was impossible to imagine for the Russians. So the ODIHR had to say there's no point us doing this mission. We don't have enough people to cover it and to have a representative opinion. And there were a very small team for the Council of Europe, and we split into 2 teams of 5. At the time, Russia wanted to return to the Council of Europe, and we want to adopt a clear position, and we met up with local authorities and officials, and our conclusion was that these elections were not on a complete free and fair basis and were quite problematic. Now, the comment I'd like to make is concerns the next point. When we were the head of the Central Electoral Committee, we were invited to a large reception that was organized in the honor of observers from neighboring countries. There are large numbers of them. Now, these are countries from Central Asia and people who were from, shall we say, extreme right parties in Europe. And there are quite a large number of people attending these elections as observers. And this was perhaps, I think, a reason for us not to take part, or an excuse for us not to take part. Now, my question is that when elections are organized in future, we always try to be very compliant with the position of the host country that's inviting us. But when we go to the country, I think that the different organizations need to have some sort of authority to be able to require certain things, demand certain things, so that we can go in conditions that allow us to carry out a proper observation and make proper conclusions. Thank you.
You want to come back quickly, which is reasonable.
Yeah, maybe just briefly, it's an important issue. Throughout the last 2 years and a half, ODIHR has always complied with national legislation when it comes also to the pandemic, including potentially, restricting, requirements for observers. For example, in some places our observer had to quarantine up to 10 days, before they be able to work. But we were following basically the rules. So in the case of the Russian Federation, I personally requested several times to be aware of the existing restrictions for people traveling to the country that would prevent observers, with the numbers on our freedom of movement. We were not provided with this information because there were no general restrictions. The restrictions were applied specifically to the number of observers, citing that a year before, for example, in the United States, we only had 50 observers because of the restrictions in the country, which we had to obtain national waiver to be able to travel to the US, and so that was the criteria. So it was more of a political decision to try to limit the number of observers, and that is why we could not accept. If it was based on existing rules for everyone, as we did in Mongolia and other places, of course we would comply with the rules.
Okay.
Matteo vient de le dire, Pierre-Alain.
Let me just respond to Pierre-Alain. Well, this was an ad hoc measure that related to election observers, and this occurred at a time when the United States made a completely different choice, in fact, in that US citizens were not allowed to go to the US for a visit, but however, election monitors or observers were allowed to do so. So it was ever so important for us to send our election observers to the US, as we would do usually speaking, of course in full compliance with the laws at the time and with the numbers that we wanted to send. But let me take this opportunity to also point something else out. We talked about this yesterday with our colleagues from the Council of Europe and the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. In the future, when there are similar cases, I think it would make perfect sense if our parliamentary assemblies could discuss this in advance and take decisions together on this. Because the worst thing that could occur would be for us to, as you were just saying, the head of the Central Electoral Committee who organised this reception, you were mentioning this, it was sort of cocktails for observers from the Commonwealth of Independent States. Now, we often see these election observers, and we do talk to them, of course, but we have different methods when it comes to observing elections. They tend to observe elections based on domestic legislation, and we have our commitments that we have, of course, to adhere to when we carry out our election observations. So we've got no issue with talking with observers from the CIS, but I think it's ever so important for us to stick to our methodology and for us to stick to what we have developed over time, working also with the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly, the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and the European Parliament as well.
We are up on time. I'm going to ask for two more interventions, first from Suna and then Liliane Tonki. Thank you. If we could keep them quite tight, that would be great.
I'll be brief, thank you, and thank you for very interesting panels. What I wanted to address was well, it's already been mentioned in the opening statement to this panel, which is the imbalance of institutions and powers when it comes to the COVID situation and other emergency situations. So what I witnessed in my own country is that the executive was incredibly visible, always, coming up with something to help the public to do and all of that, whereas the parliament was incredibly restricted in being able to do its work and to hold the executive to account and to criticize what was going on and so on and so forth. And on top of that, when parliament went into recess, the opposition didn't really have much recourse to access the voters, whereas the government would have press conferences about all of the actions that they were taking and the money they were giving out and all of the things that they were doing. The opposition didn't have any access to the media because we weren't doing anything newsworthy. We were just campaigning, and that's not newsworthy to the media. Whereas, the ministers had this big platform, and we couldn't go out and meet people because of the pandemic. So what I wonder is, in terms of the lessons that we could learn from this pandemic and other possible repetitions in the future, is shouldn't we have some counterbalancing measures to make sure that there is a balanced reporting, a balanced access to the public when it comes to these emergency situations? Because, considering it after the fact, it wasn't very fair, the access that we had to the public versus the access that the government had to the public.
It's a very good point. Thank you, Suna. And Liliana Tanguy.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to be speaking French as well, if you don't mind. I wanted to take the floor briefly on the impact of COVID-19 on elections held in France and underline the fact that the specificity of the French situation was that once the pandemic broke out, we had local elections that were due to be held a few days after the onset of the pandemic. It was therefore decided to maintain the elections based on the recommendations made by a scientific advisor or scientific council, that was set up by the President of the Republic. And it was decided that this was important and had to be done because the government and the Parliament felt that it was hugely important for elections to be able to take place despite the pandemic. And of course, there was a huge drop in the turnout of the first round of the local elections, and as a result of this, the second round was postponed to enable a proper health protocol, a much stricter health protocol to be adopted for the elections, because the information that came from the Scientific Council was very alarming with regard to how much the virus was spreading and how dangerous it was at the time. So what I'm trying to say here is that we were all very keen, both at the level of the government and the Parliament, for democratic life to continue and not to be able to be impacted by this pandemic. And that is why the parliamentarians in France at the National Assembly decided to continue to meet in person. We set up an ad hoc working party chaired by the President of the National Assembly, Richard Ferrand, to discuss what rules within the Parliament should be adapted to continue to work. And no political group objected to French parliamentarians continuing to meet in person in the chamber at the National Assembly, of course subject to a number of strict health rules being in place and being respected, and of course having a limit on numbers of people physically attending meetings, and this limit was set by health authorities. So our concern in France has always been to ensure that our rights as citizens in a democratic state continue to be exercised, including rights to exercise in person. That's why there were no remote elections as such, and that French citizens were able to go out and vote physically and carry out their voting duties as citizens, both at local and regional and national level. And this is why we placed our trust in the Scientific Council, it was called, and the scientific data that we were given to be able to continue and maintain a democratic level in the country despite the pandemic.
The word that everyone is looking for. It's fascinating to see how different countries have responded in such different ways. We are going to close with a view from an election commission. Hassan Aghamari from Morocco. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. David. Je vais parler en français.
I'm going to speak in French as well. First of all, I'd like to thank the organisers of this event. I'd like to thank the President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and the President of the National Council of Switzerland for inviting Morocco to this event. It's also an honour for me to be able to attend this meeting and to share with you our experience. And there have been some very enriching contributions made by the panellists and previous speakers. Now, Morocco has had to manage a very complex electoral process during the pandemic in 2021 in particular. We're in the heart of the pandemic, and there are three challenges we had to rise to. First of all, the visibility of elections. The Moroccan constitution does not authorize any form of legislative acts unless it's carried out by the parliament. This is why it was ever so important to organize the electoral process in Morocco. But organizing elections in Morocco meant that there were two challenges that had to be overcome. First of all, we had to ensure that the health of voters was maintained. We had 17 million voters. We had thousands of polling stations and hundreds of people voting in polling stations. So what could we do to ensure that we can manage to organize the elections in full transparency, allowing people to freely exercise their right to vote, and ensuring that there's was a level playing field for everyone, and that health rules were applied and properly respected. So it was a real challenge. And we were honoured to have been helped by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and observers for these elections. They sent a mission, in fact, under the guidance of Senor Alberto, who led a team of election observers to Rabat, Casablanca, Marrakesh and Fez to observe the electoral process in Morocco. There was a very positive assessment reached by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which was of great comfort to us. Of course, recommendations were drafted as well with regard to what could be done to improve the whole side of the public funding of political parties and also ensuring that all people can go out and vote. Now, one major positive surprise was that the turnout was more than 50%. This was at a time when in other countries the turnout was hardly more than 28%. Another very positive indicator that we recorded during the preparation of the elections was that over 2021, 2 million more voters registered. And this, I think, bears testimony to the fact that COVID gave people an opportunity to give a proper thought to how political matters are being carried out and handled and what they could do. So we did our best to protect the health of our citizens, and the elections did not cause clusters of the virus. Morocco was the first country in the region of the southern Mediterranean that allowed the possibility for political parties, including Islamic parties, to stand for elections. They had 2 successive terms of office from 2011, but in 2021, the voters said thanks, but no thanks, and so that's the strength of democracy and elections. Thank you.
Very much indeed. You brought us right up to time as well. I'm going to hand back to our chairman, to Damien, to conclude matters, but thank you so much for your very active participation, which I hope sets the scene for the rest of the conference. Damien, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everyone who's taken the floor during this session. Of course, it's impossible to sum up exactly what's been said. There are so many different points that have been made, which will help contribute to the final documents for this conference, and that will help feed discussions that are still going to be held. Let me just pick up on 2 points, if I may. The first one was that in this very room, in this very chamber, on the 17th of March this year, the Swiss Parliament voted and adopted a legislative act which changed a number of rules of the Parliament to draw conclusions from the COVID-19 pandemic and to how the Parliament should operate during such a time. We tried to improve, of course, the parliamentary process with regard to the crisis in terms of the Assembly meeting and how the committees meet. On the 17th of March, this was done, therefore. On the 19th of March, the Swiss government removed the state of emergency, and there was a financial crisis, of course, with regard to Credit Suisse institution, and attempts were made to avoid a world financial crisis. Why am I talking to you about this? Because this, of course, had a huge impact on the legislator. The Swiss government removed the emergency situation in March of last year. There was, of course, a huge problem with regard to rising energy prices and people affording their energy bills. Why am I talking to you about this? Because the legislative needs, of course, to ask ourselves what questions from the crisis can be asked and what conclusions can be drawn. And this is something that is very important that we need to bear in mind as a lesson, of course. How can we face crisis, and how can democracy function as properly as possible, even when faced with the crisis? But there's going to be another crisis around the corner. It's not something we can always expect and second guess, which is therefore why we need to have enough flexibility with regard to the workings of such institutions so that they continue to work despite any unpleasant surprises that may be around the corner. And I think what's quite striking in this particular chamber between the 17th and 19th of March is that we drew the conclusions from a crisis, crisis, but there's another crisis that was around the corner that was hitting us, and we're going to be asking ourselves just what lessons that can be drawn from this latest crisis. Now, the lady that put up her hand, who's representative from the Swiss government, David, and one question was being asked with regard to what legislative amendments can be made from an electoral point of view to take on board COVID, and not only when it comes to organising elections, of course, which have been very much impacted by this, but with regard to referendums, popular initiatives as they're called. There are specific procedures for that, and they couldn't be complied with during the pandemic in Switzerland, so we're trying to draw all the lessons, but of course there's going to be another crisis. I have no doubt of this, and there will be surprises. Now, one other point I'd like to pick up on, I'd like to thank Hassan for what was being said in his when he took the floor, and pick up on what Roberto was talking about just now, and what his call for organisations to work more closely together. Why am I saying this? Because I was part of the electoral observation team in Morocco, and I saw just how things are very well organised, despite all the difficulties posed by the pandemic. But I also saw how difficult it was for us, as Council of Europe election observers, to carry out our work thoroughly and properly, because ODIHR was not there, the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly wasn't there, the European Parliament wasn't there either, and our usual partners weren't there. The NATO Parliamentary Assembly wasn't there either, so there weren't enough of us. We didn't have enough tools to be able to carry out an in-depth analysis of the elections. I think this is something that needs to be given more thought to. The last point, I'm sure you don't know this, Switzerland exports more coffee than it exports cheese and chocolate. I think it surprises a lot of people. I'd like to point out that it's now the coffee break, and Switzerland also exports a huge amount of clocks and watches. And please come back at midday. So you have a 15-minute coffee break. Thank you very much indeed, and this concludes this particular session.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished panelists, esteemed guests. Let me first start by thanking very warmly the Swiss National Council for co-organizing with us this beautiful event, most timely as ever, as it was mentioned. Very big pleasure and honor for us to be here on the occasion of 3 anniversaries, as Mr. Cotier very well mentioned. Now, moving from the first panel, dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, we realized that natural disasters, just like the COVID-19, can also disrupt a country's political stability and undermine the democratic principles that elections are designed to uphold. To guarantee the proper functioning of democratic institutions, national authorities, including election management bodies, need to be prepared and have a risk prevention and crisis management plans ready for such occasions. Last month, our Assembly unanimously adopted a resolution on political strategies to prevent, prepare for, and face the consequences of natural disasters, which raises the issue of the impact of extreme events and the need for strategies to establish resilience in order to be able to get back to a semblance of normality after natural disasters. Our rapporteur, Mr. Simon Mutken from Belgium, visited Hatay, a province of South Turkey which experienced the worst earthquake in a century, highlighting the long-term consequences of such disasters on affected populations. His report emphasizes the importance of risk-based approach in order to effectively manage and mitigate the impact of these extreme events on our communities and societies. I would say that while the impact of the climate crisis on the frequency and severity of extreme events has been accepted by authorities worldwide, this cannot be said about the importance that this is really be taken into account. This is why our Assembly has been advocating for many, many years, and now in the run-up to the 4th Council of Europe Summit of Heads of State and Government, the first after 18 years of the organization, for the right to a healthy, safe, clean and sustainable environment to be recognized at the top of the agenda of the summit. Our Assembly also recommends that this right be fleshed out as an additional protocol to the European Convention on Human Rights or to the European Social Charter, or framed as a stand-alone convention. We are also supporting the creation of an intergovernmental committee, the so-called Reykjavik Committee, to exchange on best practice and existing models for protecting our climate. Now, coming back to our discussions this morning, our panel will explore various aspects of this critical issue, how natural disasters impact on elections organization, including legal, logistical, and strategic considerations, the impact of natural disasters on electoral campaign, accuracy of results and electoral processes, the need to rebuild trust after such events, and the role of international community support. We are honored to have a distinguished panel of experts with us today. Erik Asplund, Senior Program Officer at International IDEA, author of many books and articles on the impact of COVID-19, as well as natural disasters on elections. Mr. Bernd Föhringer, Lord Mayor of Sindelfingen in Baden-Württemberg and President of the Chamber of Local Authorities of the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities, and Emre Toros, Professor of Political Science and Dean of Faculty of Communication at Heztepe University in Ankara, and currently a Fulbright Scholar at Harvard University. I hope our discussion will lead us to identify innovative solutions and ideas for addressing the critical challenges posed by natural disasters on elections. Thank you for joining us in this important conversation, and I look forward to your contributions and insights. Without further ado, let me turn to you, Erik. International IDEA has a project on this topic. Could you please provide us with a short overview on the type of hazards that can have an impact on elections. And if you can, please, Eric, give us an insight on the number of countries that have been affected in recent years. I would be grateful if we can keep the time limits. We are in Switzerland, and we have to prove that we can work as a Swiss watch. We have lost some time, so let's be rapid and efficient. Thank you, Eric, for kicking off the discussion.
Thank you very much. So, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. First, I'd like to thank the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, as well as the Swiss Parliament, for organizing this conference and for inviting International IDEA to speak at this event. I'd also like to thank the Secretary General and the moderator and other panelists for sharing the stage with me. Also, thanks to you, the audience, for taking the time to be here in person. Election management bodies have always had to cope with natural hazards, but the threat posed by such phenomenon has become more apparent in recent years. According to a report from the Institute for Economics and Peace, the number of natural disasters, including floods and cyclones, has tripled in the last 4 decades. Now, this dramatic development is consistent with the predictions of climate scientists, and therefore it is highly likely that national and subnational elections will more frequently be affected by natural hazards in future years. Last year alone, natural hazards such as floods, storms, and hurricanes affected 6 national and subnational elections, namely the 2022 general elections in Australia, Italy, Malaysia, and the United States of America, as well as local elections in Quebec, Canada, Victoria, Australia, and Karachi, Hyderabad in Pakistan. In some cases, these natural disasters were smaller in scale, only affecting a particular community during a particular point in the electoral cycle, but be it campaigns or voting operations. In other cases, such as in Pakistan, the disaster caused by an abnormally heavy monsoon rain that caused devastating floods was large-scale, affecting a large proportion of the country and forcing the local election commission to postpone elections for 6 months. The findings from elections during emergencies and crisis and the preliminary findings of case studies produced by International IDEA on the topic indicates many recommendations relevant to policymakers and election practitioners throughout the globe. I'll mention a few. So one would be the need for EMBs and other state agencies to consider special registration arrangements for internally displaced voters. This may include temporary address changes to facilitate voting. Again, this is something that should be done now during normal times, not during the actual emergency. But anyway, the need for EMBs and other state agencies to consider special voting arrangements, such as early voting, postal voting, which can increase voters' access to polls, especially in places that are vulnerable to the effects of disasters and severe weather events. The need for EMBs to adopt risk management frameworks, resilience building measures, for example, adopting contingency plans in particular, and crisis management procedures to reduce election disruptions caused by natural hazards. For EMBs to strengthen their interagency cooperation with local state agencies that are involved in disaster preparedness, prevention, and mitigation. So I think that's it. Thank you.
Well, Eric, thank you. Thank you very much for setting the scene there. I'm going to pick up and help us move through this process a little, and we'll start with you, Bernd, if I can. You know, every disaster is a one-off. But of course, as Eric was pointing out, in a sort of climatic sense, it's part of a continuum now. We have to accept that. Germany's no exception. You have the floods, which were devastating, and across Belgium as well, and Luxembourg. So your sense of preparedness, Bernd, on a sort of before and after effect, how would you characterize it?
Yeah, thank you, David.
dear ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here and to discuss with you this important question. And as you know, already our president mentioned it morning. Our local authorities, regional authorities, we are always on the front line of events which happen. Is it the pandemic situation? Is it natural disasters we see? And so we have to react. We have to react with the possibilities we have at place. So the question at all is how can you prepare? To be honest, it depends on the dimension of an event. It depends on the dimension of a catastrophe. So I think it's not possible something like an absolute preparation to be prepared and to carry on elections in any case. But nevertheless, I think it's a question for local authorities, regional authorities, but also sure for national authorities to be prepared. Because what we heard from Eric, but what we already heard the whole morning, it's not with only single events we have in one country at one day and many years nothing ever. At the moment we have something like a status of emergency. Unfortunately, we have one event after another. We have war, we have natural disasters due to climate change. And even in countries, as you mentioned it, normally, to be honest, as a German, normally you think everything is okay, a wealthy country, not so big borderline, but no, it's different. As you mentioned it, for example, if we had this catastrophe in the Ahrtal together with our neighbor countries, with this big river, nobody could mention this dimension of a catastrophe in this area. We also have, it's not the same case, but we also have now a lot of forest fires in some areas of Germany, and normally you knew it only from the south. And so that's the point. That's really important for every level of government and also for local authorities to try to be prepared. And so just to finalize, what are we trying to do? I think nowadays it's really important, and I think there's a lot of awareness with many colleagues now, that we try to be prepared, that we go into risk management, that we try to evaluate. We know the whole set of different risks which could happen. And sure, there's a lot of analysis of experts and academics, and we look at the local level. What probability of risks, of a different risk, do we have in our very concrete situation? So we have an assessment. What about floods and high water? For example, in my area, to be very concrete, as mayors, I always try to be very concrete. In my area, we don't have big rivers and not big lakes, not a coastal area, but nevertheless, we have some a little bit hilly. And it could also happen. But in one case, we had it already. There's a lot of flood and water coming down. And so we look at the possibility. Okay, what about this risk? We are looking at different other risks, and we are working on very concrete plans to how to react, and even we use also technology. For example, you know, all this I'm not an expert in all details of technology, but for example, we use LoRaWAN communication to have some sensors and to get information. What about the situation in different areas of my city? So that's just one example. To go into risk assessment, to develop plans for different types of risk, and then also to develop the emergency plans. Together with all the services we have from regional services, civil protection services, Red Cross, and so on, and to be prepared. And so that's how we do it. We try to be prepared. We use digitalization and so on. So let's, to summarize, the decisive point is to try to be prepared. You don't know how it will happen, but then try to continue your work as good as possible.
Can I just ask that you mentioned within that forest fires, floods, I mean, there's a whole panoply of potential disasters there. How much of a sort of cover-all framework can you have? And where are the key areas for that? I mean, I'm thinking maybe special voting arrangements would come into play, whether it's flooding or whether it's a forest fire. I mean, you know, some things will cover all bases, some clearly won't.
I think that's also the point. We should try to continue our work. So as the emergency always could happen, always in different regions of Germany, in many countries, all over Europe, all over the world. And so that's why we should be prepared so that we are able to continue our services, our elections, and so on. To be honest, I think I didn't see it up to now, but I think we will have a closer look later after the conference. How are we prepared for election procedures? Are we really have a look at different types of risk management, how to continue services for the people? I guess the experts know it even better. But in my opinion, I think we really don't have up to now a detailed look, a precise look on how we could continue in a case of an emergency our electoral processes. And so I think that's still some work to be done. And even if you look at the discussions we had in the morning, I think we should also have some rules. What should we do? What should we do if some event happens, and who decides? And what about the procedures? So that it's not just only a spontaneous decision, because as you always know, sometimes politicians, even local politicians, governments can be under pressure, and there should be no misuse of a situation. And so I really appreciate the discussion we already heard. We should have some really clear rules, some clear regulations, how to react in case of an emergency.
Bern, thank you very much for that. I'm just going to point out as well, you probably received this on your desks in front of you. This is ideas, elections during emergencies and crises lessons. You can just scan there and get the full report, which is Eric's work for you there in a nutshell. But based on what Bernd has said there, Eric, is it possible for you to outline, if you like, the key areas then in which, looking across the piece, steps can be made to enhance resilience, to improve risk management, etc.?
Thanks. Absolutely, I agree with Bernd. I think comprehensive risk management is easier said than done. I think it needs to be integrated within the whole election commission at all levels. There also needs to be a risk champion, someone within the commission that reminds everyone that these plans, so to speak, these contingency plans need to be updated every so often. Also, to the extent that the election commission works with other agencies, I think it's extremely important. Now, I think this should actually happen now rather than during a crisis. During times of normalcy, that's when one can really dive in and discuss various measures that need to take place. And then, when you need to reach out to these interagencies or these other agencies for help, that won't seem very strange, right? So it will be quite normal. But I agree, risk management is definitely one side of the coin, but also I think contingency measures are needed, resilience building measures, but also crisis management procedures.
Yeah, the last part being the reactive element, perhaps, where all the rest is contingency, as you say, which is often harder to introduce in many ways. We've got some Central Electoral Commission's representatives here. We did hear from Hassan at the end of the last session, but please do join in this discussion. Some very direct messages there from Eric about what you could be doing. It'd be interesting to know what you are doing. So join us when we get round to that in a moment. We'll be there shortly, Irina. Thank you. But I do want to bring Emre in at this point, because we all recognise, as Despina said, that there is an absolute disaster on the map in Turkey this year, which, as it is, coincides with something coming up next week, some not small elections as well. Just give us a little bit of a shape, can you, Emre, on where we are with that and the challenge that has thrown up.
Thank you very much. I just want to first thank the organization committee for having me here. It's actually not very common for an academic to share their views for such high-level bureaucrats, so it's kind of very exciting for me. Turning back to Turkey and the earthquake and the intersection with elections, I'll just want to provide some basic numbers that in order to depict the picture in your minds, to visualize the whole structure before talking about the measures and related to elections. Basically, 13 million people lived in these cities which hit the earthquake hit. Approximately 50,000 people died. More than 100,000 buildings were destroyed. The total damage, according to the latest calculations, to the Turkish economy is more than 100 billion US dollars in the long run. And we have 9 million voters living in those cities. So this is the basic picture. So think about such kind of a event putting pressure on the related state bodies. So that's one point to present it. So I just want to summarize the issues under 5 headings, and let me start with the postponement of the elections to start with. The elections were actually announced, legally announced, after the earthquake. So the earthquake happened in February the 6th. The elections legally announced on early March. So the state officials in Turkey thought that they have the capability and they have the necessary and relevant infrastructure to have the elections in 3 months' time. So that's one thing, which is kind of, you know, as a Turkish citizen, I was concerned about this at the very first instance, and then see that it is possible. So that actually puts some kind of the power of Turkish state's organization under such kind of, you know, disasters. Well, of course, we have lots of the Turkish state, of course, have lots of problems about going on with those. Still, the elections were not postponed. Basically, it was not postponed due to the article, of course, in the Constitution saying that elections can only be postponed during the time of wars when there are no necessary infrastructure for voting. So you can be in times of war, you can still go elections in Turkey, but then the elections at the end were not postponed. Of course, the other thing, the second heading, is related to voter registration. The biggest problem about this, as I said, there are 9 million voters living in the area, and the first thing first, more than 3 million people were moved, so international displaced people. So according to the regulations, newly passed regulations, the electoral management body in Turkey gave the right to carry the registration of these IDPs in their new locations electronically. So which is kind of quite nice, fancy, basically, and that underlines the importance of technology in such kind of matters. But then, Turkey is not a data country. You cannot access data very easily. You can only make some interpolations or some rough educated guesses. So we know that half of these people registered in their new places, but we really do not know what's going on with the other half. So that's a big problem, basically, voter registration, when we think about the voter registration. And of course, while registration, you have to take the latest population counts, which is very difficult to finalize in those regions according to the injured and the deaths, of course. So that's another thing. And we do not have data on this as well. So it's not disclosed. So what happened to those around 1.5 million people that we do not know if they registered in their new place or not? So nowadays, there are some plans to relocate them during the time of the election, just carry them to the original places for voting. So again, we do not know how many of them will go and vote. That's another thing. The third problem, the third heading, is the allocation of MPs. As we all know, in Turkey we have 83 electoral districts. And then after giving one for each, the rest is calculated according to the population. So think about that. These 3 million people moved, and then they moved into the biggest cities, Ankara, Istanbul, and Izmir, basically. And then, of course, the population of these cities just raised, but they still have the same amount of MPs in the parliament. So that's a big problem. So it's that now the assembly, which will be kind of constituted after the elections, will not display this internationally displayed people. That's another thing. The fourth heading is the security. surely, I mean, in such kind of an problematic area, I would say, it's not very easy to set the security measures, because in Turkey you usually vote in schools, in public schools. And then most of them are just now, it's rumbles now. So there are some containers instead of them, and people will go and vote in those containers. And we really do not have any idea about how the security measures will be taken in those containers. Let alone we have doubts to have those security measures even in big cities as well. So that's another thing. And the last heading, the fifth, and I'll just finish it here for the first round, is the campaigning. The campaigning period, of course, it's a snap election basically, and then virtually or literally, parties did not do any campaign activities in those areas. It's kind of course, there are some ethical measures, ethical, considerations about that as well. But then we have an unleveled ground for campaigning in Turkey when you check the media. But this was kind of deepened when during the time of this earthquake and within those regions. So let me stop here, David, and then we can perhaps talk about these 5 headings in detail.
I will pick up on actually the first point you made there, which was really about postponement or not postponement and timing. Despina makes it very clear. You've got to realize that these natural disasters are above all a human drama. They are destroying the lives, the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands, in this case millions of people. So in terms of perception, do you have a view as to what should have been done? Do you immediately say, clearly we're not in a position to hold elections, or do you push ahead and say we must hold elections? I mean, is there a sort of where's the balance?
Well, I mean, you are bound with the constitution first thing first. I mean, yes, of course, constitutions can be changed with the necessary majorities, but at the end of the day, elections are kind of sacred institutions in Turkey. So it's kind of the Turkish political participation mostly occurs on elections, but nothing else. So we have a very weak civil society, and then this political organization and political participation usually happens during the time of elections. So if you get this out of citizens, then they will be more frustrated, basically. And this, of course, these are times that people want to respond and express themselves much deeply and much kind of, strongly. So I believe that's an educated guess as well. I don't have any data on this, but I think that having the elections on time is kind of the right decision, even if they had the chance to change the constitution. But I think that's the right thing, and Turkey has the necessary kind of power and infrastructure to make it on time.
Eric, it throws up, doesn't it? So many challenges there. You've got when do you hold the election? What effect does the disaster have on people's voting intentions and the response to the disaster itself? The validity of the electoral process. I mean, it all builds up to the word we use again and again here, electoral integrity, which must be at the heart of the search, I suppose, with the work that you're doing.
Yeah, it's kind of an umbrella term, basically.
That was actually one for Eric. I wondered if Eric wanted to touch on that.
You see.
I've got to shut you up at some point, Emily.
Thank you.
Yes, of course. I mean, everything is about really upholding electoral integrity. I think in the case of Turkey, there was an assessment done by the Election Commission in the 10 to 11 provinces most affected, and they felt that the election could go ahead given some contingency measures. This isn't, always the case. We know that. Based on international ideas, work on the topic of natural hazards and elections, we have identified several cases where elections were not able to go ahead. So this includes the local elections in Pakistan, which I mentioned earlier, but also the 2010 legislative elections in Haiti. That was postponed for 10 months due to also to an earthquake. Several local elections in the northeastern part of Honshu, which is a part of Japan, were postponed for 5 to 8 months because of the 2011 earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear accident at the Fukushima power plant. Hurricane Katrina, you remember, this is back in 2005, the local elections in New Orleans, they were also postponed for 4 months. So there are examples of national elections actually being postponed because of natural hazards.
And Bern, the difference between national and local in terms of the electoral challenge, obviously local is by very nature localized. Does that mean that some can go ahead whilst others are postponed or cancelled? How would it be easiest to manage that, or do you have to take a blanket decision?
Yeah, I fully agree with the colleagues. I think it's always important that continuing electoral integrity, that should be standard. Absolutely, it depends on the real possibilities in the city, on a national level, if you're really able to continue the electoral process. And I'm really convinced that the administrations, the electoral bodies around the country, from national level to local level, normally after a certain time they are able to recover, to continue the procedures. But to be very open, what I just reflected a little bit just now when I heard that it should be the standard. And the one point is the technical point. Yeah, sure, we should have all the possibilities, the registry, what about all the voters, perhaps not at the place. But very often the voters have an opinion, what about the crisis management? And so even just to perhaps to think about, even in a situation of crisis, if you can continue the elections, you should do it. But perhaps also the voters need perhaps a short time to think about what about the crisis management. Perhaps if you continue directly after a big disaster, perhaps you don't even have an impression what about the management. So just you mentioned before the situation in the Ahrtal. So the first days everything is absolutely chaotic. So that's really my personal opinion. I wouldn't propose in the first days, even if it's technically possible, to continue with the election, because normally the voters should come to a decision based on facts and perhaps some evaluations. And then after the first days of real big catastrophe, I think it's almost impossible to have an impression. What about the management capabilities of your government? And just in this case in the Ahrtal, we saw, for example, that the local and regional authorities have played an important role. For example, we saw that the head of one county. It was incredible what he didn't do. Yeah? It was incredible about a lesson about bad management. So he resigned. But otherwise, I think it's good that perhaps that voters have a short period, not a long period, but a short period perhaps to learn about management.
Is that something that can be built into a framework then? So that, because we heard earlier, and we'll hear again, I'm sure, when an executive makes a call on a decision, it's perceived by many members of the public as nuanced, as political, whereas if it's independently sort of set in a framework, then that is what happens.
I think absolutely. I think it should be important to have a certain framework. Yeah. So I think if you have a possibility to react on such a situation like this, sure, as a local level, you always need your higher authorities, regional level or other levels to come for decisions. For example, if you have local mayors elections in some countries, in some regions, it's a certain one date in every city. It's different. It could be. So you need your higher authorities. But I think it would be really good that you have a certain framework as an idea, as some guideline for the decisions at the spot, and just looking at this point how to react if we have such an event. Sure, we had some discussion about the international community. So in a situation like this, perhaps we could have some consulting of the international community. What's the appropriate way, not to misuse the possibilities? That's one point. But a better point would be absolutely to have some regulations, some rules, how to deal with a case like this.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to turn to you again in a moment. And remember, if you've got your Electoral Commission hat on, we'd love to see you holding it up in the air and talking to us about your experiences as well. Just before that, Eric, I'm going to it might be a slightly unfair question, this, in a sense. But have you got any examples where this risk management approach, adequate measures taken beforehand, have proved to be so effective, courtesy of a natural disaster, which of course no one actually expected to happen? But you know, I mean, have we got that far in the process yet?
Thank you, David. Not at all. Well, risk management is primarily about prevention, putting in place processes preventing and detecting negative recurrence that an organization may encounter. And therefore, it's quite difficult to know exactly if it was successful or not. Many measures that election commissions put into place, especially in terms of the pandemic or for a natural disaster, for sure. I mean, my gut feeling is yes. I mean, it has actually resulted in a better run election with less crisis, right? But it's sometimes very difficult to know exactly, if the investment. I mean, it was to what extent it was. It's difficult to quantify. Yes. Put it that way.
Yeah. I mean, that's the perpetual challenge, Despina. Yeah.
Thank you, David. I'm just looking at the time, and I think we are getting impatient to hear from the floor. Just before opening the debate, I would like to remind our participants that our Assembly will participate into election observation in Turkey. Some parliamentarians will be moving straight from here for this observation, together with the OEC Parliamentary Assembly, ODIHR. We had a very good meeting yesterday with the ODIHR Director, Secretary General of the Assembly of the OEC, and Secretary General of NATO Assembly. And of course, the tragic event in Turkey was a case study that we had not foreseen when planning this conference. Yeah. And I think it's very good for us to have here the chair of the Turkish delegation and other Turkish MPs who can also share with us how they dealt with it in such a short time. And this is where I think academics and experts' words were put really into practice in a very short time. And maybe we will know even better after these elections how it worked out.
Indeed. But thank you for the prompt, too, because we are going to turn to the floor now. I'd like to first ask for Nacho Sanchez Amor, as an MEP from Spain, and also the standing rapporteur on Turkey for the European Parliament.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, Despina and colleagues. I think the main outcome of the earthquake regarding election is not about organizational aspect, but the mood of the country, the psychological stance, because inevitably the way the government dealt with disaster is going to be at the center of the public discussion. And we have to look for there is a match between the narrative of the government saying Turkey is a global actor and the real and actual deliveries in this situation in which the ability of the state has been put on the most painful test. Because this is one of the questions that everybody assesses. Some decisions regarding to the earthquake, the initial decisions were very slow. Why? Because the political system is hyper-centralized and growingly authoritarian. That means every decision, even in this situation, is expected to come out from 5 or 6 desks in the presidential palace. There is no real functional parliament, there is no real functional government, everything is about the palace. And when the palace takes some time to make decisions, immediately municipalities were there, immediately rescue teams from, let's say, the traditional foes of Turkey were there in the country, and the government decided not to deploy the military, or just to deploy the military with the rationale of there were some lootings, not to help to relieve the people. That puts the deliveries of the government at the center of the discussion regarding the election. This is one of the key issues. I think, Professor Toros, some of the decisions are okay. You can change the seats overnight. The provinces, even if they lost some population, they have to keep the seats, and the provinces receiving people has to keep the seats. I think it's the only decision. The registry has been facilitated, but we only have 130,000 people newly registered in another place. That means 1.8 million people displaced has not been registered. But your law says that the right to vote has not to be affected by registry problems. I don't know what does it mean, if that could allow some polling station authorities to authorize people to vote, even not having been registered. And the other problem is, as you know, this figure of 50,000 pronounced deaths, it's very conservative. There is other figures talking about 200,000. Let's double the figure. What is going to pay? Because these persons probably dead are registered, and are registered in provinces in which the president of the state is minor, the president of observers is weakened, and in which the parties are taking the role of transporting people from other places to vote. This is the landscape from our point of view, very worrying, but I think always we praise the organizational aspect of the Turkish election. We always said in our OSCE and country, well administered, but the problem in Turkey is never occurred during the election. Things have been happening long before the elections, and this is a crucial aspect that we have to take into account. Thank you, David. Sorry for being
not at all.
So extended.
Thank you very much indeed. But let's build on the Turkish perspective, because Ahmet Yildiz is with us, as Despina was saying, head of the Turkish delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly.
Thank you, sir. Indeed, it is an unprecedented challenge for Turkey, and I should say that we are managing quite well. Mr. Toros summarized the situation. Let me add something. I am one of the deputies who went to Hatay and Kilis Antep, the earthquake region, the same day of the earthquake. Of course, earthquake happened amid the debates on the date of the elections, because constitutional timeline was between 7th of April to 15th of June for constitutional reasons. And different proposals were on the table, starting from 14th of April to 30th of April, 14th of May, or 15th of June at the latest. Really, at the first week of the earthquake, if you were on the region like me, the judgments on whether we can do it, whether we should do it, was speculative. Because you are amid rubbles, you don't know the exact numbers, nobody knows. Search and rescue are going on. So the question on whether we should postpone it, and can we postpone it, two questions. Let me summarize my opinion from the region. Constitutionally, of course, the Turkish constitution stipulated war as the only reason to postpone any election in Turkey. Because we have not seen such a disaster. We always have disasters, especially earthquake, but this one was overwhelming. And although the Constitutional Court, to my knowledge, has a different verdict on this, that it stipulated, I think, the war-like conditions also, but it has never been applied till now. Of course, if it had been decided to postpone it, it would lead to long-time arguments, controversy on the legitimacy, on the integrity. Luckily, we didn't postpone it. But let me ask the audience here and the experts. The timeline, the deadline for 15th of June, constitutionally, what would happen if this earthquake took place on 15th of May or 30th of May? It is impossible to organize an elections. It could happen 1 week before the deadline. So we should think about it, not just Turkey and others. Certainly, if it had happened on 15th of May or first week of May, we couldn't do it on time, on deadline. We should have to postpone it in a way. Of course, the necessity, proportionality, temporariness are always okay. but realities are on the ground. We made a simulation. At that time, I was a potential candidate also for an election. I am not now, so I can I can talk from both sides of the aisle. High Electoral Council in Turkey is a very powerful institution. Their decisions are final, and they made the judgment that we can do these elections on time. What are the extraordinary repercussions? One thing only, as Mr. Toros summarized, the seats of these earthquake-impacted provinces remain the same. So in these provinces, some MPs to the parliament may be elected with 3,000 or 4,000 less votes compared to the normal period. But in my home city, I am from Denizli, electing 7 MPs, each MP most probably will have to get 1,500 votes to earn the seat. So it will not, in my opinion, it will not have serious impact on any number of seats in favor of this party or that parliament. Okay. Maybe in one of the big cities, only one, according to the distribution of the votes, if it is so tight. But I doubt that also. So that's why I am happy that we didn't postpone it, although at the beginning, including myself, was very suspicious if we can do it. Okay. But now I don't see any debate in Turkey about the integrity, about the smoothness of the elections. I think all measures were taken. The rapporteur was in the region. He intends to go again, I think, after elections.
Okay, so
that's it from now on. I don't want to go to other issues on elections, on democracy of Turkey.
No, but that's a very clear perspective on your confidence in the process, which is significant. Thank you very much indeed for that. I'd like to turn to Irena Habziadic also for an intervention. Irena?
Thank you. I just wanted I'm very thankful to the speakers because they open all these issues related to the pressure that are put on electoral management bodies. And of course, as someone who is coming together with the President of the Commission from Bosnia and Herzegovina, we had this natural disaster, not on this scale like Turkey with earthquake or Pakistan with flooding, but we had the flooding, and the small flooding in Bosnia is big flooding for us. And we were very worried how we will organize elections. We were lucky at that time, it happened in 2014, that we were part of the election management risk tool pilot project that was actually conducted only in 3 countries all around the world, Kenya, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Colombia. And we actually got this excellent tool that every electoral management body can download from the IDEA website and can measure everything as coming as external or internal risk. It can be violence, it can be natural disaster and everything. It helped us a lot in 2014 to measure the progress with flooding. Can we organize elections in the whole municipality, or we have to move some polling stations, because we had this map and we coordinated with Municipal Election Commission. But we did that. It helped us, but after that, when project ended, we didn't continue. And that is the problem of every EMB that I know in the world. We are we are pretty weak. We are not enough resilient. We need assistance in crisis management and capacity building and strategic management planning, and we actually do not get this support in this idle period when you don't have anything. This initiative that we are sending to the Parliament, that we have situation in our legislation that we cannot postpone the elections for more than 30 days. We didn't do that during the COVID, we cannot do that during the flooding. And what will be later? The Election Commission will be dismissed because we didn't do the job. No one cares. So I think that this election management body, as the main body who is leading elections, should be put in completely new, very important focus for these new challenges.
Very interesting. Irene, thank you very much indeed for that. I want to turn to Pierre-Alain Frides as well, please. Thank you.
Je m'exprime en français. Merci.
Thank you. I'll be speaking French. I do thank all of the panelists. I think they've made extremely interesting comments. I myself just have one comment, and then I have a question, really something that I wonder about with reference to Turkey. My first comment is this. This session is really asking us about the impact of natural disasters on elections. And then this afternoon, when I have the honour of chairing a panel, we're going to be talking about the impact of conflicts, of war, of violence, in other words, of things that human beings do. Whereas here we're talking about natural disasters. And it seems to me that when you come to things that human beings do, there's always something that you can do to resolve the problem. I know I'm perhaps getting into this afternoon, but it does seem to me that when people use violence against other people, then you're in a situation that's very, very difficult to resolve. I'm just comparing what's been said here with what's going to be said this afternoon. That's my comment. Anyway, thinking now more specifically about Turkey, I was involved in 2017, where there was the question of constitutional change in Turkey, and I was an observer of the votes held at that time. Part of the country, the southeast, the Kurdish region around Diyarbakir, was actually in a state of emergency, whereas the rest of the country was not. And that made things very complicated because there were slightly different procedures there. And when it came to counting the vote, we also saw that in some parts of the country, the voting stations had been so overwhelmed that voting papers that had not been stamped were nonetheless being accepted because there were just so many people involved. And you might have a voting station where there were perhaps 400 registered voters, and so you had 400 ballot papers that had actually been stamped, and yet in the end you had many more people coming along, and therefore some voting slips had to be used that hadn't been stamped. And we've been told from what we've heard today that sometimes you have displaced persons or differences in infrastructure that has meant that some people haven't been able to vote. So I'm wondering, really, this is my very specific question, are you going to have the system that we had back in 2017, where you had 400 per voting station? Or are you going to recognise the fact that there might be some places that will have more than others? It was a bit blurred, as I remember it, and the result was very tight at the end of the day. So what I'm saying is that voting in such circumstances does tend to cast some doubt on the outcome of the vote.
Thank you very much indeed. We are going to end in 5 minutes when I will allow Despina to make some concluding thoughts there. But we're also very pleased to say that Ahmet Koç is with us as the Turkish delegate to PACE. So, Ahmet, thank you.
Madame la Présidente, chers participants et participantes,
ladies and gentlemen, Chair, I'm delighted to have the floor now, representing the opposition in Turkey. I see I'm the last speaker this morning. I can be very brief. I wish to state the following. The earthquake that occurred in Turkey in February was a geological disaster. And it was an unprecedented tragedy. I've never seen anything like it in my life. Everything was destroyed. Around 10 cities were affected, and in just a few minutes, everything was destroyed. According to official figures, more than 50,000 people lost their lives, and hundreds of thousands were injured. Whole families have disappeared. And other families simply were never able to bring their children into the world. And the human cost of this is almost impossible to take in. There are areas that are just rubble, that are just ghost towns. There's nothing there. And I really would like to thank everyone who's done their very best to help us as we try to cope with this unprecedented tragedy. As you have said, we have elections coming up next Sunday. And in accordance with the Turkish constitution, Elections can only be cancelled or deferred in the event of war. So, people who've survived that earthquake or people who have left the areas that have been destroyed are going to vote. And they are now registered in their new place of residence. Now, of course, it's extremely difficult to organise elections in the areas that have been affected by the earthquake. But the people of Turkey, I can tell you, really want to vote. They want to exercise the democratic right to vote despite this disaster. And certainly, both the governing party and the opposition in Turkey are working together. We have to work together to rebuild the destroyed towns, yes, but also we have to rebuild a state based on the rule of law to ensure that we can have impartial and independent justice in Turkey, that we can guarantee freedom of the press, freedom of thought, freedom of expression. In other words, we have to rebuild democracy in Turkey.
It does. I just want to pick up on one or two of the themes that I've got here for my panel, if we can throw it down the line as briefly as you can, really. But there's a very good point there about capacity building and the lack of capacity, the lack of bandwidth to take on the challenge of risk management, of prevention, preventative efforts. But I mean, that is clearly a very real problem, isn't it? Across the piece, it's simply the last port of call for a lot of organisations. It's not the first thing they're thinking about, it's the last.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also very important, just this point about capacity building, having facilities, perhaps the tools also, the training of staff. And as we're looking always about conclusions, I would just like to mention, I think it's a very interesting debate, but in the end it should be very practical. And as I know, a lot of discussions going around in the local and regional sphere. To be honest, there are not so many discussions about this capacity building. I think it's really a circle of experts with a lot of experience in election observation missions, and I think we really should transfer this information, transfer these experiences to different local and regional organizations and levels. Many organizations discuss the question about crisis management, risk management, what about do in major crisis situations like now, but really the specific point. What about preparing? I heard about this very interesting about this risk management tools, the preparation I heard from Bosnia, capacity building and so on. That things are something we should take with us, and now I will finish.
Absolutely.
Going.
Eric, you were nodding there.
No, I fully agree. I mean, it's quite interesting that, I mean, I wish we had more time to talk about capacity building. Election commissions should engage in training their operational staff, right? And in many cases, countries around the world have, this is made part of the legal framework. So training is a must in order to work in an election, well, in a polling station. But, you know, this training can also be extended to other issues. We did see during COVID-19 that obviously a lot of election officials had to be trained on health and safety measures during polling day. And I think this could also extend to other issues related to countries, for example, flooding, if that's an issue, or wildfires and so on.
Eric, thank you. Emre, last thought.
Well, thank you. I just want to comment on the issues which are not related directly with the earthquake, but the whole electoral integrity in Turkey. So I would agree with the commentators wholeheartedly. I don't have any kind of an objection. A state of emergency, very big problem. I mean, because it just kind of, re-levels the districts among them. So it's a big problem. It's a big problem. But, in a recent paper that we have developed, we have seen that it did not actually affect the votes. But this is an academic work. I don't know, how can you, trust it or not? That's your choice. And of course, we are quite centralized. Now the administration in Turkey is quite centralized, and this creates a big problem especially under the conditions like earthquakes. So these are kind of things that we have to think about. What can be done, like you said, this capacity building and proactivity. For example, we do not have this early voting system in Turkey, not yet. But we should be thinking about this, and we should be setting this, for example, because as a country of floods, earthquakes, and all disasters, we should be thinking about that, and then expand the system accordingly. So I'll be more than happy to chat afterwards with the other comments as well. Thank you very much.
There will be plenty of opportunity in just a moment as we head to lunch. We're going to conclude that session. I'll just express my thanks to the panel, but Despina, I'd like to hand to you to conclude before, I should say, we have a family photo here straight after the session, so don't rush out. We'll come for a photo. Despina.
Thank you, David. Well, while we run out of time in a country where time is so precious, I think the key word of our discussion was timing. Timing of the decision we need to take and of organizing the risk management approach. So I think what is, for me, the key lesson to take away is that we shouldn't wait for the natural disaster to happen. We have to take decisions now, in times of normality, let's say. And this is exactly what I think came out also from our Turkish guests. What would have happened if the earthquake had happened just a few days or a few hours before elections? This is why I think, on the one hand, national parliaments should enact legislation to deal with such emergency situations in normal times and anticipate it. Anticipate alternative voting arrangements, early voting, postal voting, online voting. And this is why I think it's so important for election management bodies to be prepared to handle this situation on the basis of recommendations anticipated. So I think this is the key word to take with us. And of course, the role of local authorities in all these arrangements, because they are the first ones to react to natural disasters and to manage elections after such disasters. We have spoken a lot about disasters, David. I hope we will have a nice lunch now and a not disastrous one.
It's the nature of the beast, I'm afraid, isn't it, when we're the topic. Despina, thank you very much indeed. Thanks again for your contributions as well. As I say, we're going to have a family photo now. So you're in the right place at the right time for that, and then lunch. And we resume at 2:30, back here at 2:30 sharp. Thank you.
That everybody is welcome in the evening.
I'll do that later on. Yeah.
Hello. Good afternoon.